Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. We set up camp off a trail near Lake Superior, about a mile into the woods. It was late August, cool at night, but still warm in the day, and there were 5 of us. Me, my buddy Brian, his cousin Kyle, and 2 girls from school, Marissa and Leah. None of us were outdoors experts. We had cheap tents from Walmart and way too much junk food, but we wanted one last trip before school started. We'd picked a clearing maybe 30 yards across, flat ground with pines circling it. Brian had brought a little hatchet and spent an hour hacking dead branches down for the fire. By midnight, we'd roasted hot dogs, burned half our marshmallows, and told dumb stories while the flames got low. The girls turned in first. Brian and I stayed up longer, poking at the logs, talking about nothing. I remember Kyle already snoring in his tent, loud enough that Marissa yelled at him once to roll over. I must have dozed off sometime after 1. When I opened my eyes, it was still night, but darker than I expected. The fire was out. Just a shallow pit of gray ash, no glow at all. At first I thought I'd woken because I was cold. My sleeping bag was thin and I hadn't zipped it properly. Then I noticed the light. It wasn't moonlight. The moon had been thin that night, barely more than a slice. What I saw was the trees themselves. Every trunk and branch around the clearing seemed to be glowing just a little, like someone had run soft wires of white through the wood. Not bright enough to see detail, but enough to outline each tree in a dull shimmer. I sat up fast, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks. The others were asleep. Brian was rolled onto his stomach in the bag beside me, breathing slow. Leah and Marissa's tent was zipped silent. Kyle's snore carried steady from the far side. Nobody else stirred. I rubbed my eyes hard and looked again. The glow didn't go away. The trees looked almost transparent, like the light was inside them. Not pulsing, not flickering, just steady. The branches overhead had faint veins of white that made the sky look darker by comparison. I tried whispering Brian's name. He didn't move. I reached over and nudged his shoulder. Nothing. He stayed heavy and limp like he was in deep sleep. I tried again, harder, same result. His breathing never changed. That was the first time I felt a sharp edge of panic. I thought carbon monoxide, some gas, but there was no fire left, no smell except pine and dirt. And I wasn't dizzy. My chest felt tight, but I knew it was fear. I unzipped my bag slowly and got up. My shoes were half off, so I slipped them on without tying the laces. The air was colder than I expected. The glow was just strong enough that I didn't need a flashlight. I walked to the edge of the clearing and touched one of the trunks. It felt like regular bark, rough and cool. My hand didn't glow when I touched it, but I swear I felt a low vibration, like when you touch an appliance that's running. Not strong enough to rattle me, just a faint hum under the skin. I pulled my hand back fast. My stomach dropped. I stood there listening. The woods were completely silent, no insects, no rustling. Even the lake, which had been faintly lapping earlier, sounded gone. My ears rang in the silence. I turned to check the others, all still asleep. None of them had moved at all since I first woke. That was wrong. Usually somebody shifts or coughs, especially Kyle. His snores were the only living sound. I crouched next to Brian and shook him hard, both hands. He mumbled once, something like muff, but didn't wake. His body resisted like dead weight. That scared me more than anything so far. I considered running. The trail back was clear enough, but the idea of leaving them felt impossible, like the glow had me pinned there. Instead, I pulled on my jacket and walked a few feet deeper into the trees. The glow seemed stronger once I left the clearing. I looked up and saw the branches crossing like pale veins, the light running through them like fluid. Some of the taller trees had faint streaks climbing their height, as if something was moving inside. I crouched low, heart racing, and stayed that way for I don't know how long. My watch had stopped at 2:17 a.m. when I checked it. The second hand was stuck. I tapped the glass and nothing changed. When I finally went back, the tents and sleeping bags looked the same as before. Everyone out cold. But the fire pit had changed. The ashes were spread wide, smooth like a hand had passed over them. The little rocks we'd ringed it with were pushed outward in a perfect circle, clean lines in the dirt. I didn't touch anything. I sat on the log we'd dragged earlier and just stared at the shapes. I wanted to wake someone, to shout, but it felt like if I raised my voice, something worse would happen. Eventually, maybe an hour later, maybe 5 minutes, the glow began to fade. It didn't flicker. It just dimmed evenly across every tree until the woods were black again. When it was gone, the sounds came back in pieces, a cricket chirping, the faint lap of water, a breeze shaking needles. I waited until I could hear my own breathing calm down, then forced myself into the sleeping bag. I don't remember falling asleep. At dawn, Brian was the first to stir. He sat up, stretched, looked at me, and asked if I'd been awake all night. I said yes. He didn't press it. The others got up, complaining about the cold, rummaging for breakfast. None of them mentioned anything strange. When they noticed the fire pit, Marissa blamed raccoons. I wanted to argue, but my throat locked. The ring of rocks was too neat, the ash too smooth. I just nodded. Later, while packing, I checked my watch again. It ticked normally, but the time was 7 minutes behind Brian's. I reset it without saying a word. On the hike back, I kept waiting for someone to bring up the light. Nobody did. They joked, tripped each other, complained about mosquitoes. I walked in silence, replaying what I'd seen. That night, at home, when I shut the bedroom light off, the outline of the trees burned in my eyes like I'd stared at something too bright. It took hours for the shapes to fade. I didn't tell anyone. I still haven't. I don't know how to describe it without sounding crazy. All I know is that those trees were alive in a way they shouldn't have been, and whatever was inside them, it wasn't sleeping like the rest of us. I was driving home from work on that Thursday around 7:30 in the evening. The sky had that dull pink hue that comes right before full sunset. Nothing dramatic, just that sort of washed out color that makes the trees look darker than they are. I had left the office later than usual because of a pile of paperwork, and the highway was practically empty except for a few other cars heading the same way. I usually take the county road that cuts past the old Miller farm, the one that's been abandoned for years. The fields there stretch out for miles, flat and wide, with nothing to block the view. I like it because it's peaceful, even when I'm stuck thinking about work. That night, though, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a reflection from my own windshield, or maybe a glint off a silo, I don't know. But it stayed in the same spot as I drove closer, so that didn't make sense. I slowed down and squinted. Hovering just above the northern edge of the field was a silver object. It wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small car, but it was completely still in the air. No blinking lights, no rotor noise, nothing. Just this reflective silver shape, perfectly stationary. I blinked, thinking maybe it was a trick of the light, but it stayed there as I got nearer. I even rolled down the window, half expecting to hear wind or some kind of mechanical hum. There was nothing except the normal sounds of the road and my tires on the asphalt. I don't know why, but I instinctively took the next left onto the old gravel road that runs along the field. I wanted a better angle, maybe to see if I could make out details. The gravel crunched under my tires, and the car's headlights swept across the field as I slowed to a stop. And it was gone. The field was empty. Just the grass and wildflowers and the outline of a fence at the far end. No object, no shimmer, no nothing. I checked around, even drove back and forth slowly, hoping I just misjudged the angle. Nothing. Not even a shadow where it had been hovering. I sat in the car for a while, the engine ticking as it cooled, trying to make sense of it. The air felt heavy, warmer than it had been just a minute ago, and I noticed the usual sounds of evening. The crickets, the wind through the grass, were quieter than normal, almost muted. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my eyes had caught a reflection off a cloud, or maybe the sun lingering on a piece of metal. But my gut told me I hadn't. There was a clarity to the shape, a presence. I drove slowly back onto the main road, keeping my eyes on the field. Still nothing. The world had resumed its normal rhythm. The birds that were still awake chirped, a distant dog barked, and the faint hum of a tractor from a neighbor's property drifted over. Everything normal, except for what I had seen. I took a detour through the next subdivision, trying to shake the unease. Lights came on in houses as people returned from work. Kids yelled from yards. Nothing seemed out of place except me, my pulse, and that image I couldn't erase. At one point, I caught a glint in the rearview mirror, something low to the ground, reflective again, but when I swerved slightly to look, it was gone. No vehicle, no animal, just the road and empty yards. I shook my head, laughed quietly at myself, and kept driving. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had fully set, leaving a soft violet haze over the neighborhood. I left the car running for a moment, staring out at the horizon beyond my house. The field past the next row of houses was dark, nothing to hint at what I'd seen. Inside, my husband asked how the drive was. I told him uneventful, nothing to report. I couldn't bring myself to describe it. The words felt wrong or too weird, or maybe I wasn't sure I believed them myself. That night, when I went to bed, I kept seeing it in my mind. The object, hovering perfectly still, reflecting light off its surface, as if it had weight but no sound. My dreams were fragmented, nothing concrete, just flashes of silver against pink sky, like looking through the corner of my own memory. The next day, I drove past the field again during my lunch break. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No disturbance in the grass, no evidence it had been there. The farm was as empty as ever, weeds growing along the fence line, the old barn doors hanging loose. A week later, I asked a coworker if they'd seen anything unusual, planes, helicopters, even a hot air balloon. They said no. I tried online forums about strange sightings in the area, but found nothing that matched the time or place. Still, I catch myself glancing at that field whenever I drive past, hoping maybe for a glimpse again. Most days it's just grass and fence posts and the fading remains of the old barn. But some nights, especially when the light hits the horizon just right, I swear I can see a silver shimmer, low and still, hovering above the grass, waiting. I've driven that road dozens of times since, alone and with friends, during the day and at dusk. Nothing ever appears again, but the memory of that shape, perfectly still, and the way the evening grew quiet around it, hasn't left me. Even now, when I pass the field, I check the sky first, just in case. I pulled into the Willow Creek rest stop just before 10 that night. The highway had been empty for miles, one of those stretches where the road cuts straight across the plains, and the only lights are your own headlights and the stars overhead. I was hauling a load from Wichita to Denver, and it had been a long day of sitting in a rig that smells like diesel and stale coffee. I figured I'd stretch my legs, grab a soda, and use the restroom before hitting the road again. The lot was nearly empty, just a few cars and trucks scattered around. I parked my rig near the edge, where I could see the highway stretch in either direction. The night was calm, almost unnervingly quiet for a rest stop. Usually, you get people chatting, tires crunching over gravel, the occasional music from a car radio leaking into the air. Tonight, none of that. I was just about to climb down when I noticed it. Every vehicle in the lot, the trucks, the sedans, even a beat-up minivan tucked in the corner, blinked their headlights off and on at the same time. Not staggered, not in some random pattern, but perfectly synchronized like someone had pressed a universal switch. I froze on the steps of my cab. Blink, off, blink, on. 3 times, and each time the lights went dark and bright together. I looked around, half expecting someone to step out, laughing, trying to freak me out. But the lot was empty. Nobody moved. I figured maybe it was a circuit issue, some glitch in the lot's electrical system, but the streetlights stayed steady, and my own truck lights didn't flicker. It was only the parked vehicles, all of them, reacting as if someone or something had touched them. I rubbed my eyes and crouched down, trying to see if maybe a reflection off something shiny had tricked me. The lot's asphalt was slick from a rain shower earlier that evening, but no, nothing that could account for the synchronization. Then I noticed a glow on the horizon over the far side of the field beyond the highway. It was faint at first, dull orange, like the light of a distant fire. Not a sunrise or sunset. The sky was dark already, the stars beginning to pop out. The glow hovered, not flickering like flames, but steady, low over the ground, maybe a few dozen feet off it. I grabbed my phone, ready to take a picture, but as soon as I unlocked it, the glow brightened for a second, then faded completely. Just like that, nothing but the dark plains stretching toward the horizon. I checked the clock. 10:12. I could feel my pulse thumping, the kind of adrenaline that makes your hands shake just slightly. I walked toward the edge of the lot, trying to get a better look. There was no heat, no smell, nothing on the air to explain it. It wasn't smoke or fire. It didn't even look like a light from a distant town. Just this soft, dull orange blur that appeared, lingered for a second, and vanished. I turned back to the vehicles. The headlights had returned to normal. They weren't blinking anymore. I walked past a couple of trucks, ran my hands along the hoods. Nothing unusual. No fingerprints, no moisture, no dust disturbed. Everything completely normal, except for the memory of the blink and the glow. I climbed back into my cab and tried to shake it off, telling myself I'd been staring at the lights too long, that maybe a reflection or an electrical surge had caused the blink. I rolled down the window to listen. The lot was silent, except for a soft wind through the nearby grass. Usually even a slight breeze rustles leaves and shakes a few branches, but the trees along the edge of the lot were still. I kept the engine running and sat there for a while, eyes fixed on the horizon. Nothing returned. No orange glow, no headlights blinking, nothing. After a few minutes, I started the rig and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched straight ahead, empty as it had been. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a power surge in the lot had triggered the lights simultaneously. Maybe a distant flare or industrial light had cast that orange glow, but none of it fully explained the timing or the coordination. The drive back was quiet. I didn't pass another car for 20 miles. Occasionally, I glanced at the lot in the rearview mirror, expecting some odd reflection, some hint that what I'd seen was still there. Nothing. Just the empty plains and the dark line of the highway behind me. When I got home later, I told my wife I'd had a long night and needed a shower before bed. I didn't bring up the blinking lights or the glow. I think I wasn't sure if I even believed it myself. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying it in my head. I checked online forums, local news, anything about unusual lights or events along that stretch of highway. There were occasional reports of flares from agricultural work or hunters, but nothing that matched the timing, nothing about synchronized lights in a rest stop lot. A week later, I returned to the rest stop, during the day this time. The lot was normal, full of cars and trucks parked haphazardly. Everything looked ordinary. I walked past each vehicle, looking for any sign of a malfunction, a scorch mark, or anything to explain what I'd seen. There was nothing. Every hood, every windshield, every tire, normal, undisturbed. I still drive that route regularly. Most nights are uneventful. Every now and then, when the lot is quiet and the wind is still, I glance across the expanse of asphalt, and I half expect it. The headlights to blink together, the dull orange glow to appear above the field. It never does. But when I recall it, the memory is vivid, as if the world paused for a moment that only I saw, leaving me behind when it returned to normal. I was halfway across the ridge when the first thing that felt wrong happened. I'd left the trailhead around 4 that afternoon, planning to be on the summit for sunset and back down before dark. Snow had fallen overnight, clean, soft drift that filled boot prints right away, and the ridgeline looked like a map with fresh ink. I like winter hikes because things are simpler. Your pack has what you need, and the world narrows to footfalls and breath. That morning, I checked my gear twice. I had crampons, an extra battery for the headlamp, a paper map folded in my pocket, and a charged phone more out of habit than expectation. The oddness began small. About 40 minutes after I left the saddle, my compass needle started to jitter. I thought it was the old compass itself, cheap plastic, so I pulled the phone out to check my GPS. The mapping app showed me where I was, roughly, right along the ridge, but the blue dot kept sliding a few yards to the left, then snapping back, like the signal was trying to find a place that wasn't quite there. The sky was clear above the pines, no planes, no storm. The wind was steady and cold and seemed to come from everywhere at once. I rubbed my mitten on my face, blew warm air into my hands, and kept moving. A flock of ravens broke off a stand of dead firs and took off in a ragged V. They'd been calling before I reached the top, like a typical evening noise. Then they went silent as they rose. Silence landed the way snow does, sudden and muffling. The only sounds left were the scrape of crampons and my boots packing powder down into hard, squeaking snow. The ridge opened up into a shelf that looked down over a wide valley. I dropped my pack and sat on a rock to take a photo because the light was good, pale and blue, the way winter afternoons go long. The next weird thing was the headlamp. I like to keep it clipped where I can reach it, and when I grabbed it to check the battery level, the LED cut out for a second, just a blink. No warning. It came back on when I clicked the switch again. I shrugged and blamed cold in the batteries, except nothing else had failed on me that day. My phone stayed at 50%. My watch kept time. Still, there's a small animal part of you that notices a light going out and getting back on by itself on a ridge with no one else around. I noticed the valley because it felt empty in a way I didn't expect. Usually you see trucks on the far road, a plume from a chimney, or a light here and there. This time, there was only the broad gray of snowfields and the dark line of trees. About a mile down and to the east, a column of pines broke, and I could see the flat like a bowl. I took another sip of water and checked my map. It was the slope above Clearwater Hollow. No houses on my side, a cluster of cabins on the other, and the river cutting through like a thin vein. Then, without sound, something changed in the valley. It rose quietly. That's the best word I have for it, rose. At first I thought it was a flare or some kind of lantern because it was bright and pin-sharp against the dull snow, but it didn't wink or burn like flame. It started as a single point of white, no color bleeding at the edges, and it moved straight up. No horizontal drift. It lifted like a balloon released on a string, and then the string had been cut. The motion was vertical and precise. I saw it from the moment it left the ground. There was no contrail, no smoke, no ripples in the air. It just unspooled upward, small and steady, and then it vanished into the thin blue like somebody turned off a tiny, perfect light. I remember checking my phone right away. The signal bars were normal. The map still showed the valley. No alert popped up. I thumbed the camera and got a few frames, blurry because my mittens and cold made my hands clumsy. When I zoomed in on the photos, there was nothing more than a bright dot in one and a smear in another. The metadata on the file showed the exact times, 5:12:23 p.m., but that told me nothing I didn't already know. For a minute, I stood very still. The ravens were clacking again somewhere, like a record had been put back on. A cabin dog started barking far below, and the sound skittered up the bowl and died. My stomach dropped in that peculiar way that's half fear and half the gravity of being alone on a ridge. I used my poles to steady myself and considered hiking down the way I'd come, which seemed sensible and boring and the right answer. Before I moved, there were other small things to notice. Snowflakes had stopped falling. There hadn't been a storm, but now the shelf above the valley held no wind. My breath didn't fog the way it had before when I exhaled. It just disappeared. The pines across the way, which minutes before had shown the warm brown of trunks and white of snow, had a thin pale rim to them, like someone had outlined them with a faint wash of light. Not glowing, exactly, more like highlighted. I spent a long time hiking that ridge back and forth as if the motion would do something practical. I told myself a drone, some testing, a spotlight from a far-off rescue exercise, anything with an origin I could label. None of those seemed to fit. Drones make noise. Rescue lights would have patterns and people would have radios. If there had been a flare, I should have seen smoke. Nothing fit the way that white point rose like a needle through the air and then erased itself. I made it off the ridge before it was fully dark, keeping my headlamp clipped on low because the light around me felt too thin to trust. In the parking area, there were a couple of cars, boots in the snow, and a man leaning on his truck hood, his breath a small, heavy cloud. I asked him if he'd seen anything unusual while he ate a sandwich. He screwed up his face like he was trying to remember. Saw a light low in the valley earlier, he said slowly. Looked like a lantern. Then it went. His voice sounded tiny under the height of the pines. Driving home, I kept glancing east where the ridge had been. The highway spread like a pale stripe under the headlights. My radio cut in and out with static for a stretch, once or twice a thin whine that matched the frequency of my own teeth. Back in my apartment, the world smelled like thawing boots and coffee. I told my sister about it on the phone because that's what you do. Say the one strange thing to someone who will answer without weighing it down with work. She said maybe it was a satellite catching the sunlight. Maybe, I said. It didn't feel generous as an answer. I went back to the photos the next day and tried to get proof out of pixels. There wasn't much. I called the ranger station on a whim, trying to sound like I was reporting a hazard rather than an oddity. The woman I spoke to logged my complaint and said there had been no reported activity that day, no rescue calls, no prescribed burns, no aircraft. She thanked me and said they'd file it under miscellaneous. Weeks later, I still think of the way that light rose, vertically, exactly, with no signal or sound, and then no mark left on the valley. The ridge is quiet most of the time when I go back. The snow packs differently on one slope, but it might be nothing. People in the mountain towns trade off explanations because that's how people make sense of glimpses that resist neat labels. I don't have a tidy one. I only have the memory of watching a bright point climb up out of snow and trees until it met empty sky and stopped being something I could name. I pulled over on a rutted 2-track when the sky went weird. I'd been chasing the cell all afternoon, hot, muggy air bulging off the highway, the kind of late May day that makes the whole sky feel like it's waiting. My name's Ben. I do freelance storm work with a beat-up Subaru and a dash cam that's seen better storms. I wasn't out for a record or fame, just the next decent wall cloud and whatever footage I could stitch together for the weather shows. The field off County Road 12 had a dark, low base, and the wind had that tight metallic smell before anything obvious happened. I killed the engine, put the camera on the hood, and watched. A few small things felt off before anything really happened. First, the birds. The swallows that had been skimming over a drainage ditch 2 minutes earlier vanished like someone closed a curtain. It wasn't just quieter. The entire layer of little flight calls stopped dead. Then my radio started to hiss. Not the usual chatter, but a thin, high static that would climb and fall without a pattern. My phone, which had been steady on full bars, flashed no service for a beat, and then came back as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was all normal. Atmospheric propagation, ionospheric weirdness, whatever the forecasters say when radios play up. But my gut notice is old at this. I've been out on nights where storms behaved normally, and nights where they didn't. And that bird silence was the sort that tightens your shoulders. The wall cloud dropped fast. 1 minute, the base was low and things smooth. The next, it had a lip and a darker core. Wind gusted from the southeast, and the tall corn in the fields lay flat in sheets. I could hear the blades of the grass snap under pressure in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. I threw the dash cam at the windshield mount, which doesn't do much but keeps a steady picture for whatever I catch. That's when the funnel dropped. Thin at first, then thickening like someone had pulled taffy. It didn't look cinematic. It looked practical. A rope of condensed cloud with dust beginning to spiral at its base. Trucks on the far county road slowed to a crawl. A farmer in a pickup turned off his lights and parked on the shoulder. He waved at me like we were sharing a private thing of necessity. And then the lights appeared. Inside the pipe, maybe halfway up the visible column, 3 lights were locked in place. They weren't strobes or aircraft nav lights. They were steady, sharp, white, arranged roughly in a triangle with one point downward. The funnel was whipping and tearing at the field, and the air around it had teeth, but those lights sat steady as a lamp on a table. They didn't jitter with the gusts. They didn't smear with the speed of the rotation. It looked wrong in the exact, precise way that makes every hair on your neck honest. I raised my camera and zoomed until the image pixelated. The lights held. My recorder picked up nothing different. No extra frequencies, no mechanical whine. Just the ambient roar of wind and distant thunder. I got out of the car because that's what you do. You want the unobstructed angle, the sound that fills the chest. The porch of old corn and telephone poles leaned under the pressure of the storm. When I walked forward, the grit of soil was knocked at my boots like little bullets. A bolt hit to my left, bright, close, and it cracked the world open like a fist. The 3 lights vanished the instant the lightning lanced through the column. 1 fraction of a second they were there, the next nothing in that exact patch of sky. The funnel went on. No dramatic collapse at that moment, but the memory of those lights had a kind of absence, the shape of a hand. I blinked hard and checked the footage. The file shows the funnel and then a bright flash, and then the funnel continuing without its interior lights. After the strike, the whole storm acted like a thing embarrassed. Winds shifted, the gust front rolled through, and what had been a steady climb of electricity dropped into regular thunder. The radio that had been hissing came back to life with a dispatcher asking for reports. My phone chirped a dozen messages from other chasers. Did you see that? Lights inside? One text had a shaky clip from a passenger in another car. The lights are visible on a few frames and then gone. People started to respond in real time, trading coordinates and guesses like a sport. I drove closer when the funnel moved off the field and the county patrol waved traffic away. The farmer's truck was gone. He'd already headed to his cellar. I parked under a telephone pole because it felt safer for reasons I couldn't explain and watched the cloud pull east. For a long time afterward, all the small electronics around me behaved like a fridge motor. They hummed and clicked, a beat late. My headlamp dimmed for a second when I tried to jog video on a small handheld, and the minute it came back, the footage had a single frame where the lights were bright and then nothing. People in town called it later a power surge, a trick of light. I called it what it was, the footage in my camera and the farmer's dash cam backing me up. The National Weather Service logged an event. A tornado touchdown reported no fatalities, property damage minimal. They didn't say anything about 3 steady lights in a rotating column. Official reports don't usually do that. I sent the raw clip to a couple of meteorologist friends, and one of them emailed me back with a cautious, interesting. Glints off hail, maybe? With a shrug emoji. Another asked for GPS timestamps. I packed up before the storm could remind me how small we are. Driving back to the county line, the field smelled like wet iron and corn, and something clung to the air that my chest kept trying to measure. I was tired in the way people are after close, precise fear, awake and too alert. I went home, unloaded the rig, and watched the footage again on my laptop with the sound down, pausing at the frames where the lights sat like frozen buds inside the funnel. I posted a clipped version to my feed for other chasers. The comments filled with reasonable, skeptical, and excitable replies. That's the mix storms attract. By morning, everything on the field looked like it had always looked. Flattened rows in the corn, a few broken fence posts, a farmer who squinted at me over his coffee and said he'd seen the funnel but didn't see no lights, boy. I don't blame him. People look at weather and see what they know how to see. I kept the raw files and the timestamps and a jaw that felt a little loose from the thunder. I don't have an answer. The footage is there, and I have the memory of 3 steady points holding inside a thing that should have torn them to pieces. I have a dash cam, a farmer's video, and a radio log that shows a spike at the exact second the flash hits. I slept that night with the laptop closed and the phone on the bedside table. The next day, I drove past the county road where I'd left the car, and the grass bent the same way. People go back to work. Corn keeps swelling. The sky keeps doing what sky does. The lights are still in my camera files, stubborn and inexplicable, and I keep opening them, not because I want an answer, but because I want to remember precisely what looked wrong against everything we think we understand. I went out to the point because I couldn't sleep. It was one of those October nights where the fog sat low and thick, the kind that makes the harbor lights look like someone spilled honey on the water. I took a thermos and my old flashlight, no headlamp, nothing fancy, and walked the usual path down the rock slabs toward the shore. The surf was a steady hush, not the angry crash of summer storms, just the slow, regular breathing of the sea. I like that sound. It makes the rest of the world small. Before anything odd happened, there were small things that didn't fit right. My truck clock had jumped 20 minutes forward on the drive down, the kind of glitch you blame on a loose battery. The CB on the bench by the old pier hissed and then went dead when I clicked it, a burst of static that sounded like someone ripping paper. The gulls, which usually argued at midnight over a broken crab trap, were quiet. I looked for them, then realized all the birds had gone hush as if someone had closed their mouths from above. I stood on the rocks and sipped from the thermos. There was no moon to cut through the fog, just a pale glow from the town behind me. A small lobster boat idled out in the channel, its running light a puncture the color of a match. I could hear the engine in the distance, and then it clipped out, sputtered, and died for a minute, just long enough for the wake to smooth. The owner had his radio turned up, but I couldn't hear a word. He coaxed the motor back to life and went on. That was when I saw something pale on the horizon. At first I thought it was a fishing buoy or a flare, some normal night thing you learn to read quickly. It wasn't like that. It rose out of the water a little way off, small and white, and it hung a foot or two above the wave crests like someone had set a lantern on a table. It didn't flash or pulse, it just glowed steady. A clean, cold light that didn't look like anything I keep around the house. I swear I held my breath without meaning to. The thermos warmed under my hand, and the fog turned the light into a soft disk that pooled on the surface. It hovered there, maybe 30 yards out, not moving like a buoy and not bobbing with the swell. It slid inward a little, then drifted back, as if testing the water. No sound came from it. No motor, no hiss, only the usual small noise of the sea. I picked up my flashlight slow because the sensible part of my brain wanted to see it better. The beam trembled a little where I aimed. The incandescent bulb is old and lazy. The light from the object didn't react, it just hovered. I thought for a moment about calling the harbor master. I clicked the handheld radio and nothing answered. The boat whose engine had died earlier had gone on. I couldn't see a silhouette. The fog swallowed sound in a way that made distance worse. Then, because that's what people do when they want to make something less mysterious, I flashed my light at it. The pale glow folded in, not like a person ducking out of sight, not like a bulb switched off, but like something that had been lifted and put under the surface. The water stilled in that spot, like oil poured in, and the thin shimmer under the foam swallowed the glow. For a second after I flashed the light, there was a ring of brighter sea, then nothing, as if someone had erased that inch of ocean from sight. My heart pounded, which is embarrassing considering I'm 50 and have spent half my life on cold decks and late watches. I clicked the radio again. The static came back, and a voice half a mile up the harbor called, "You see anything, Tom?" It was Ray from the bait shop. I told him what I'd seen, and he swore quietly and said he'd had a customer say the same thing from a different dock at almost the same time. A pale light rising and going under when someone shone a torch. He told me to stay put. I didn't like the way his voice made a question of it. The thing, I don't know what else to call it, came up once more a few minutes later, further toward the headland this time, and it moved slower, almost lazily from one trough to the next. I trained the binoculars, and the image on the glass made it look almost surgical, a perfect white coin on the dark. When I tried to film it with my phone, the recording stuttered. The file saved 1 second of bright and then a blank as if the lens had been covered and then uncovered. There were other small oddities while I watched. My watch, the cheap digital one I forget to set right, blinked and then showed the right time again. The old pier clock that never keeps time ticked once and then stopped. The little fishing boat's radio that had been working went to a hiss the second the glow appeared and stayed that way until it sank. Things that had been ordinary a minute before started to have edges, like a cup with a hairline crack you only notice when you try to pour. I stayed until the light didn't come back. Dawn takes its time in that fog. It bled gray for what felt like an hour. I walked back to the truck slow because the rocks were slick, and I didn't want to stumble on a thing I couldn't explain. At the bait shop, Ray was sweeping the stoop, eyes red from too little sleep. He nodded to me without asking and handed me a coffee as if I hadn't left 3 minutes ago. "You see it?" he asked. I told him everything I could remember in small pieces. He listened and then said his customer had posted a clip on the local bulletin board, some kid's shaky video from a shoreline 2 coves over. The video was grainy and the clip cut after a second, but if you slowed it, you could see a pale patch over the water and then a sudden darkening. Comments below were a mix of jokes and guesses. Lantern, whale, prank. Someone else wrote that a retired Coast Guard guy in town swore he'd felt a pull on his compass that night. I drove home and the road smelled like seaweed and wet asphalt. I told May about it while I made sandwiches. She laughed at the idea of me waving a flashlight like a kid at a magic show, but she didn't roll her eyes. She asked if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I told her the thermos was still warm and my camera showed 2 blank seconds. She said maybe it was some research crew, some biologists shining lights into the water, and I let that lie rest there because we both prefer answers that make a small amount of sense. The sun climbed and the fog thinned into a dull spit of warmth. I went back in the afternoon with my boat because fishermen like to know what's out there to complain about. The place where the glow had been was ordinary. Waves, a few silver slashes of fish, a smudge of dark that could have been weed. I dragged the echo sounder over the spot and it just read water, just like it always does. The crew from the other docks said they'd heard stories from other nights. A light that rose and retreated, some boats' radios cutting out, a compass that spun for a second. Mostly they shrugged. People in this town are used to the sea doing odd things. At dusk, I looked out the kitchen window and the horizon was clean. If something came up from the deep, it didn't come back up while I watched. I went to bed with a small, persistent unease and a dozen ordinary noises to tuck around it. The fridge clicking, May's radio in the other room, the little distant cough of engines down at the harbor. The last thing I remember before sleep was the idea that the sea had kept one secret, and that maybe we had looked at it wrong. The next morning, the tide left extra kelp on the rocks where I'd stood, and I swept it up without thinking. Life at the coast has rules. One of them is you carry on even when the water gives you something you can't put a name to. I was wiping down the fender of a 2001 F-150, the garage lights making the red paint look almost too clean when something moved across the hood. Not a shadow, not a tool dropping, just a ripple, like someone had thrown a finger across the surface of water. My rag froze mid-swipe. I looked up and the ceiling light behind me caught in the reflection, and for a second the truck seemed to bend toward me, edges wavering like heat rising off asphalt in July. Only it wasn't hot, it was late February, and the garage heater had been humming quietly for hours. My name's Leo. I run a small auto shop just off Main Street in Cedarville. Usually it's quiet at night. Most folks bring their cars in the morning or the weekend. But every few weeks, someone rolls in late, and I stay behind to finish work. That night, I was the last car in, a brake job for a neighbor's truck, nothing fancy. I had music playing low, windows cracked just enough for the February air to sneak in, and the fluorescent lights buzzing in that way they do when they're about to flicker. At first, I thought it was my own reflection messing with me. I reached over, touched the hood, solid metal, and the ripple vanished. I leaned back, wiped my hands on a rag, and the feeling didn't go away. The air looked wrong, like it had a weight it shouldn't have. I glanced at the overhead fluorescent and noticed it seemed to shimmer slightly, edges wavy, even though the bulbs themselves were fine. It reminded me of when I'd see the horizon bend over hot asphalt during summer runs to the lake. But it was cold. I shook my head and told myself I'd been staring at the hood too long. That's when I noticed the shadows of the cars outside the garage doors didn't match the streetlights. They stretched and bent where they shouldn't have. One moment the light hit the crown of the truck, and the next it seemed to curl upward, bending around a shape I couldn't identify. I got that tickle behind my neck, the one that tells you to look away but also says you can't. I went over to the workbench to grab a flashlight. When I turned back, the entire ceiling of the garage seemed to ripple, not like a curtain in the wind, but like the air itself was bending in slow waves. I leaned against the truck for balance, heart starting to race. My eyes caught the reflection in the F-150's hood again, and this time it wasn't just a ripple. It looked like the surface of the hood was vibrating in slow motion, the edges of the lights above stretching into faint arcs. The cold air had that metallic tang you sometimes get in a snowstorm, but it was stronger, like it was thickening the room. I stepped back, and then the music I had playing, a low, bluesy track, stuttered, warped for a moment, like a record spinning unevenly. My phone on the workbench did the same thing. The screen glitched, then went black for a few seconds before rebooting. I muttered something under my breath, thinking about the wiring in the garage, maybe the fluorescent flicker affecting the circuits. But the breaker box looked normal. The fuses all fine, nothing unusual. The air grew heavier. I swear I could feel it pressing slightly down, the way air feels before a heavy snowstorm. And then the ripples on the truck started moving independently of the lights above, sliding across the metal like liquid metal. My flashlight caught a glint from the ceiling, and the beam seemed to bend slightly as it passed through the air. I tilted the beam, tried to track it, and the shimmer followed, always just beyond direct sight. I grabbed the keys to my car and stepped outside. The night was cold, calm. The street was empty. The garage door's shadow stretched across the asphalt, normal. But the sky above the building wasn't. It hung there like a curtain of heat haze, wavering, trembling with faint silver distortions. I squinted, rubbing my eyes, and saw faint streaks, slender, pale lines that moved slowly across the sky in impossible directions, straight up and back down again, like the air itself was rolling over something. I pulled my jacket tighter and stepped to the edge of the lot. A car drove by, its headlights cutting cleanly through the distortion. The shimmer stayed above the garage. When the car passed, the light from its beams bent slightly as it entered the warped patch, stretching in weird lines, then snapped normal once it was past. I felt a pull to watch, like my brain couldn't let the anomaly go, but I also felt a deep unease, a warning I couldn't name. I called my friend, Tom, who's been an amateur astronomer forever, and told him to look at the sky over Cedarville if he was up. He said nothing at first, then, Leo. That's, I don't know, man, maybe just Aurora solar storm? I laughed nervously. Aurora in February, in Illinois? He didn't answer. By the time I decided to go back inside and lock the shop up, the shimmer had faded slowly, like steam rising off a cold street after a brief sun. The hood of the F-150 looked normal again. The fluorescent lights buzzed in their usual way. Everything seemed normal, except for the heavy feeling in my chest, the faint metallic tang in the air, and the vague memory that the air above the garage hadn't obeyed gravity for a little while. I drove home slowly, doors locked, windows up. In my driveway, I stepped out, and the sky overhead looked perfectly normal, the stars faint through high clouds. Nothing to see, nothing to explain. But I knew what I'd seen, felt, and I kept catching myself glancing at the garage from the end of the street. The next morning, everything seemed as it should. No traces, no physical evidence. The metal on the truck was cool and solid. The heater was just humming. But I remembered the ripple, the shimmer, the air bending like liquid above the ceiling, and the way my skin had felt like it was vibrating in time with something I couldn't see. I've gone back to that garage plenty of nights since. Nothing ever happened again. The tools are still lined up the same, the trucks sit where I left them. The fluorescent lights buzz normally, the air feels cold, empty, normal. But every once in a while, late at night, I swear I see the metal surfaces flicker with a hint of motion. Just a hint, like a memory of what was up there, hovering and bending the night sky itself. I was driving back from visiting my sister, the road stretching out in long, flat lines between the fields, the kind of country road that feels endless when the sun's just starting to dip behind the horizon. It was that strange time of day, the sky bruised with pinks and purples, and the air was quiet, except for the faint buzz of cicadas and the tires on gravel. I hadn't seen another car in 10 miles. As I passed the first farm, I noticed the horses in the paddock. At first, I thought one of them had stopped mid-step because I caught it at a weird angle. But then I realized every single horse, every cow, every goat, even the few chickens wandering near the fence, they'd all frozen. Just like statues, necks craned upward, eyes locked on the same point in the sky. I slowed the truck, craning my neck to see what they were staring at. And then I saw it. A pale light, circular, hovering just above the far edge of the fields. It wasn't moving, not drifting, not bobbing in the wind. It just hung there, perfectly still, like someone had pressed pause on it. The color was weird, white but not bright, not like a spotlight. Softer, almost like the glow of a full moon, except it didn't illuminate the ground. The fields stayed dark in the shadows. I stopped the truck completely, the engine ticking over in the silence. I fumbled for my phone, trying to take a picture, but the screen just refused to capture it properly. Every shot came out like a white smear, no shape, no edges, nothing that looked like what I was seeing. I frowned, looked back at the animals. They hadn't moved. Every hoof, every feather, every ear pointed the same way, unblinking. I felt my stomach twist. I remember thinking that it had to be something natural, some weird trick of the light or a reflection. Maybe an early stage of lightning from some distant storm. But the sky was clear, no clouds, no haze, nothing that would make a light hang like that. And I swear there was no sound. Usually in the country at dusk, you hear wind in the corn, a distant dog, a tractor in the distance. But for that stretch of road, it was dead silent. I sat in the truck for what I thought was maybe a minute, but my watch later told me it was closer to 5, just staring. The light didn't change, didn't pulse, didn't even flicker. Then slowly, like it was breathing, it shrank a little. I blinked, and it was gone. Just gone, the sky dark and empty again, leaving the stars beginning to pop out overhead. I blinked again and looked down at the fields. The animals were moving now, shaking themselves, stomping, calling out like nothing had happened. Horses ran toward the barn, cows wandered lazily back to their feeding spots, chickens clucked and scattered. I rubbed my eyes, half expecting the light to reappear, to see them stiff and staring once more, but they were just animals again, ordinary and oblivious. I started driving again, slow, checking the rearview mirror for movement behind me, but the road stretched empty. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing up, expecting to see the light trailing me, something keeping pace, but the sky was just the sky. A mile or so down the road, I noticed the first signs that something felt off beyond the memory of that light. The crickets had gone completely quiet, not one, not a single chirp. The wind that had been brushing across the fields had stopped, leaving a strange, unnatural stillness. I caught the hairs on my arms rising, and I realized I couldn't hear my own breathing properly anymore. Like the silence was pressing in. I passed another farm. Normally there would be dogs barking, some old barn cat visible in the light of a window. Nothing. The animals inside the pens didn't even stir as I drove by, and for a second I swore the shadows of the buildings were moving ever so slightly, like the structures themselves were shifting. But when I blinked, everything was normal again. By the time I turned onto the highway leading toward my town, the night had deepened. Streetlights started to appear, the smell of asphalt warming in the residual heat of the day filled the air, and the world seemed to snap back into familiar focus. It was as if that stretch of road, those farms, that light, had been a pocket of some other reality, tucked inside the ordinary one. I called Maggie as soon as I got home. She didn't answer at first, and I was half relieved. I didn't want to sound crazy. When she finally picked up, I told her about the light, about the animals, about the silence. She paused, a long silence, and then said, "You're not the first one this week. Some guy saw a pale circle hovering near the old Miller farm, out by County Road 12. It was the same night, same time. I had no idea how he could have known or why, or what the hell we were both seeing miles apart. And that was the strangest part. Not that I'd seen something I couldn't explain, but that it seemed like someone or something through our little stretch of the world, touching it briefly, leaving no trace, and then vanishing. I didn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that pale circle hovering in the sky, the animals frozen in place, the silence pressing down like a weight. I drove the same road a few days later during the day, and everything was normal. Horses were eating, cows were lowing, the wind moved the trees. Nothing abnormal at all. But I keep thinking about the edges of that light, how it didn't illuminate, how it didn't make a sound, and how when it disappeared, everything went back to ordinary, like it had never happened. I can't explain it, and honestly, I don't know that I want to. I still drive past that stretch at dusk sometimes. I check the fields, the fences, the animals, and every so often when the wind dies down, when the light is fading just right, I swear I see a faint shimmer in the sky, a pale circle holding itself just above the horizon, and I have to remind myself to keep going. I woke to the faint sound first, a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate right through the ground beneath my tent. I tried to convince myself it was the wind rattling the guy lines or maybe a distant stream picking up in the night, but it was too regular, too deliberate. I rolled over and listened, the hum keeping pace like a heartbeat, evenly spaced, almost musical. I unzipped the tent flap slowly, careful not to make noise. The air was cold, a damp chill that made my breath cloud in front of my face. The trees around the campsite swayed lightly in the wind, but there was nothing moving that shouldn't be. Then I saw it, a pale glow between the trunks, just enough to illuminate a small patch of the forest floor. It wasn't bright, just a soft, shifting light, almost like a shimmer, and it moved ever so slowly, drifting between the trees in a pattern I couldn't follow. I blinked and focused on a single spot. The glow vanished. I shifted my gaze again, trying to catch it in motion, and it would appear somewhere else, always faint, always just out of reach. I felt my stomach tighten, a mix of fascination and fear, but my survival instincts told me to stay still. I didn't want whatever was out there to know I was awake. I reached for my flashlight and shined a narrow beam toward where the light had been. Nothing. The glow didn't react, didn't fade. It simply wasn't there. The humming didn't stop. It was still rhythmic, steady, and somehow louder now, pressing against the walls of the tent. My pulse was thudding so loudly I could feel it in my ears. I crawled out onto my knees and unzipped the tent fully. The forest around me was impossibly still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And then, just at the edge of my vision, a faint movement, a shimmer, a bend in the air. The glow returned, soft, shifting, appearing to hover a few feet above the forest floor. I froze. My hands shook on the tent fabric, and I realized I couldn't hear the usual forest sounds. No crickets, no owls, no rustle of small animals. It was as if the world outside had been muted. I pulled my compass from my pack, something to anchor myself to feel normal. The needle spun violently, twirling in circles for a few seconds before jerking back to point north. I dropped it, fumbled to grab it again, but the needle refused to stay still for longer than a heartbeat. I stared at it, then at the glow, then back at the compass. My head was spinning faster than the needle, and I felt a creeping, unnerving sensation, as though the space around me wasn't behaving the way it should. I took a slow, deliberate step out of the tent. My boots crunched lightly against the frost-hardened ground, and the glow shifted immediately, as if it had noticed me, drifting back toward the tree line. I followed it cautiously, inch by inch. Every time I got a better view, it would vanish or drift out of reach. My flashlight didn't seem to penetrate it. The beam passed through empty air, and when I swept it across the glow, it disappeared entirely. I tried calling out, voice low at first, then louder, thinking maybe some lost hiker or forest creature was responsible. Nothing. The hum remained steady, rhythmic, indifferent to my presence. My ears strained for echoes, but the forest stayed eerily silent. I realized that even though I was moving, the glow seemed to adjust instantly, maintaining distance, as though aware of my attempts to approach. I crouched behind a large pine, breathing shallow, watching it float lazily between the trees. It seemed to pulse subtly, brightening and dimming in a slow rhythm that matched the hum. My mind started running through every possible explanation. Reflection from a hiker's lantern, a glow from a distant mountain village, some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But the movement didn't make sense. It wasn't following the contours of the terrain, and the hum wasn't mechanical. It felt deliberate, almost intelligent, though I had no words for it. After a while, I sat down on a fallen log, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The glow lingered, hovering in the darkness, but seemed less frantic now, more like it was observing me. I pulled my phone from my pocket, hoping to capture something, but the screen showed only darkness, not even a smear, not a trace of light. I considered recording audio, but every time I touched the phone, the compass in my hand twitched again, wildly spinning before settling briefly. Time became slippery. I don't know how long I sat there, but I began to feel disoriented, my watch ticking off minutes that felt like hours. My flashlight batteries were running low, and the cold was starting to bite through my jacket. The hum hadn't changed. The glow remained, patient, almost expectant, lingering at the edge of sight. Finally, I realized I couldn't stay there. I had to get back to the tent, to warmth, to something solid. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the light. Each step seemed exaggerated, like the forest itself was stretching around me. When I reached the tent, I crawled inside, zipped up, and pressed my hands over my eyes for a moment. The glow was gone. The hum had faded, leaving a ringing in my ears that slowly subsided. I lay back on my sleeping pad, shivering despite my layers. I could still feel the presence, a residual weight in the air, like the forest hadn't entirely returned to normal. My compass lay on the floor of the tent, needle still spinning for a few moments before finally settling. I stared at it, the glowing needle pointing north, and I felt a mixture of relief and unease. Morning came slowly. The sun rose, brushing pink light across the peaks, and everything looked ordinary. Frost melted from the trees, the wind picked up, birds began to sing, and the forest smelled like pine and damp earth. I stepped outside, scanning the area carefully. Nothing. No trace of the glow, no disturbance in the snow, no sign of anything unusual. I packed quickly, wanting to leave. On the drive back down the winding mountain roads, I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see that soft shimmer trailing me. But the Rockies looked like the Rockies again. Solid, serene, utterly normal. I can't explain what I saw that night, not fully. I've hiked these mountains for years, and I know what's natural and what isn't. That glow, that hum, the spinning compass, they don't fit anything I've ever experienced. I've told a few friends, and most of them chalk it up to imagination, or weird electrical interference, or fatigue. Maybe it was. But every so often, when I'm in the woods alone at night, I catch a flicker at the edge of my vision, or hear a faint pulse that isn't my own heartbeat, and I remember that night. And I didn't see it again, and I haven't gone back to that exact campsite. But sometimes when the wind is still and the forest is quiet, I swear I can feel that slow, deliberate presence just beyond sight, watching, waiting, unmoving and patient. It's enough to make me think twice before hiking those trails alone after dark. I woke to a sound I couldn't place, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was faint at first, just enough to stir me from sleep, and then it became impossible to ignore. I lay still, listening, trying to convince myself it was the wind through the pines or maybe the distant roar of a mountain stream. But the rhythm was too regular, too steady, like someone or something was keeping time just beyond the edge of my awareness. The tent walls shivered lightly, and I could feel a subtle vibration under the ground. I reached for my headlamp, clicking it on softly, but the beam barely cut through the darkness. I unzipped the mesh slowly, careful not to make a sound. The air outside was cold, cleaner and sharper than any air I'd breathed in town, and it smelled like frost and pine. That's when I saw it. A faint glow, pale and almost imperceptible, drifting between the trees a little way from the tent. It wasn't bright, just a soft shimmer, but it moved in a way that made me pause. It wasn't bouncing with the wind or the trees. It was floating smoothly, deliberately. When I tried to focus, to see it clearly, it would vanish, leaving nothing but shadows. I blinked and it would appear again in a slightly different spot, still hovering, still shifting. My pulse picked up. I thought about calling out, but my voice felt weak, swallowed by the night. Instead, I just watched. The hum was louder now, pressing against my chest, vibrating through my ribcage. Every instinct told me to move, to get away, but I was glued to the spot. Something about the way the light moved felt intelligent, as if it knew I was watching. I grabbed my compass from the pack. At first, it spun normally, pointing north, but as I held it steady, the needle jerked violently, twirling in circles for several seconds before settling again. I dropped it onto the ground, then picked it back up. Same thing. The compass needle refused to stay still. My hands shook, and I realized I was holding my breath. Slowly, I eased out of the tent, taking careful steps across the frozen dirt. The snow crunching under my boots sounded louder than I expected, echoing in the stillness. The glow responded, or maybe it just moved with the same rhythm as before, but it felt like it was aware of me. It hovered closer, then drifted away, always keeping that exact distance. I raised my flashlight, sweeping the beam through the trees. The light passed right through the glow as though it wasn't there at all. When I tried to shine it directly at the patch of air where the shimmer had been, it blinked out completely. The hum remained steady, almost like a pulse I could feel more than hear. I crouched behind a small pine, trying to get a better view without drawing attention. The glow hovered between the trunks, pulsing faintly in time with the hum. I felt an unexplainable pressure in my chest, a weight that didn't belong to anything physical. The forest had gone quiet. No wind in the branches, no rustle of small animals, nothing but the humming and the soft, shifting light. I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of electrical phenomenon, or ice crystals reflecting starlight in a way I'd never noticed. But the way it moved, the way it vanished and reappeared, didn't match anything I'd ever learned about optics or atmospheric conditions. It felt deliberate, like it was testing me, watching me. Time started to lose meaning. I didn't know if I'd been outside for 5 minutes or half an hour. My phone battery was almost dead, and when I tried to turn it on, the screen flickered and died. Even the compass acted strangely again, the needle spinning before snapping north. I thought about retreating, heading back into the tent, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The glow seemed to be forming shapes now, not defined, just subtle distortions in the air. I held my flashlight in front of me again, but it made no difference. The shapes melted away as soon as I tried to look directly at them. Finally, I took a deep breath and backed toward the tent. My boots sank slightly into the frost, and I noticed the ground felt warmer in spots, like patches of heated earth, though there had been no sun for hours. When I reached the tent and zipped it closed, the glow lingered at the edge of my vision, just beyond the mesh. The hum faded, leaving only a ringing in my ears that slowly subsided. I sat on my sleeping pad, shaking slightly, staring at the floor of the tent. The compass lay beside me, its needle steady at last. Outside, the forest seemed ordinary again. Frost glittered in the starlight, and the branches swayed lightly in the wind. It looked like a normal Rocky Mountain night, except for the memory of that glow, that humming, and the feeling that nothing I could touch or see was entirely real. Morning came with a pale sun breaking over the peaks. I packed my gear quickly, scanning the area for anything unusual, but the shimmer was gone. No footprints, no disturbance in the snow, nothing to indicate that anything had been there at all. Driving down the mountain, I kept glancing at the trees, half expecting to see that faint light drifting again. Nothing appeared. Even now, months later, I remember the way the glow moved and the hum vibrated in the night air. I've hiked those trails many times since, but I avoid camping alone at night. Sometimes, in a quiet forest at dusk, I swear I catch a flicker at the edge of my vision or hear a pulse that isn't my own heartbeat. And I remember that night in the Rockies, when nothing in the world felt entirely normal, and something, whatever it was, watched me from just beyond the trees. I was making a delivery run for the warehouse late one Thursday night. The road was usually quiet, nothing but the desert highway stretching for miles with the occasional truck passing by, but that night felt heavier somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. The sky was clear, a deep blue fading into black at the edges, and a cold wind had picked up, rattling the mirrors on my truck. Around 1:30 a.m., just past the junction where Route 47 curves into nothingness, my radio cut out. Static at first, then complete silence. I flipped through the dial, hoping to catch something, anything, but it was dead. Usually I'd roll my eyes, blame the equipment, but this time it was too abrupt, too complete. Even my CB wasn't responding. The highway looked the same. Endless asphalt, the faint shimmer of heat off the surface, a few distant hills outlined against the horizon. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a car, someone pulling alongside, but there was no taillight, no reflection from headlights, nothing that looked like a normal vehicle. Just a small, pale light hovering just above the asphalt. It moved alongside my truck smoothly, maintaining the same speed without any obvious propulsion. I slowed slightly, expecting it to drift away, but it stayed with me, matching every tiny change in speed. I glanced at my GPS, hoping to check where I was, and that's when the first real unease hit me. It blinked out. No signal. Nothing. Just searching in the corner of the screen. I tried to laugh it off, probably a glitch, but my hands gripped the wheel tighter than I realized. The light wasn't bright. It was more like a soft glow, like the faint shine of metal in the moonlight. It wasn't harsh, didn't cast shadows, but it seemed aware. A few times I caught myself thinking it was adjusting its position, anticipating my moves. I couldn't hear anything. No engine hum, no whirring, just that still silence that felt unnatural in a desert where even the wind usually carries sound. I decided to take the next turn off, thinking maybe it would lose me on the side road. As soon as I slowed, the light followed, sliding across the asphalt as if it was glued to the surface. My stomach knotted. I've driven this stretch 100 times. I knew every curve, every rise. There was no way anything could move that precisely without some guidance. Then, without warning, it shot upward. 1 second it was hovering at bumper height, and the next it was streaking straight into the sky, vanishing past the clouds in a blink. I swear, it didn't accelerate, it just moved. Impossible speed. My head snapped back, and I caught my reflection in the side mirror. Pale, wide-eyed, grip on the wheel like my hands would leave prints. I stayed on the side road for a minute, trying to process what just happened. My GPS flickered back on eventually, signal returning like nothing had happened, but the feeling didn't leave. Even the radio came back, crackling a little, then stabilizing. Everything returned to normal, but I knew it hadn't been normal. I kept driving, talking to myself out loud, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a drone, I told myself. Military tests, experimental tech, but there was no sound, no flashing lights, no pattern, nothing like a drone. The movement had been too fluid, too deliberate. A few miles later, I saw another car parked on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking. I pulled up beside it, thinking maybe someone else had seen the same thing. The driver, an older man in a beige pickup, looked at me with an expression that mirrored my own disbelief. "You see that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, lights out there. Wasn't nothing normal." We didn't exchange details, just shared a long silence looking at the desert. Then he drove off. I stayed a little longer, eyes on the asphalt, but there was nothing. No glow, no flicker, just the empty highway stretching into darkness. When I finally made it back to the warehouse, the sun was just starting to lighten the horizon. I told my manager I'd been delayed by equipment checks, kept the story to myself mostly, though the older driver's reaction made me wonder if anyone else had noticed. Over the next few days, I checked the stretch of highway on my own during the daytime. Nothing out of place. The asphalt, the hills, the cacti, all ordinary. My GPS worked fine, radio clear, and I could swear I kept expecting the pale light to show up around each curve. But nothing did. I've driven that route plenty of times since, always at night, always paying attention. Sometimes I feel like I see a glimmer in the corner of my eye, a reflection on the asphalt, the faintest pulse of light, but when I turn, nothing's there. Tucker, my friend who often rides along, has noticed it too a few times. He doesn't say much, just stiffens, ears up, staring ahead. I haven't told anyone else, really. People would laugh it off, call it hallucination, fatigue, desert mirages. But I know what I saw. That light wasn't normal, and the way it moved, it wasn't bound by the rules I understand. Every time I take that stretch of highway now, I double-check the radio, glance at the horizon, and keep my hands tight on the wheel. It doesn't always appear, but I know it's out there somewhere, moving in ways I can't comprehend, silently aware of me, waiting just beyond the reach of my headlights. Even now, months later, I think about that night. The memory of it, the silence, the impossible movement, the signal loss, stays with me. I don't know if I'll see it again. Maybe it was a one-time thing, or maybe it's always there, just out of sight, reminding me that the world has corners I don't understand, and some lights can move without reason, without sound, and without warning. I pull over sometimes just to look. Nothing ever returns exactly. But the highway feels different now, alive in a way it never did before, holding its secrets in the dark, just waiting for the next late-night run. It started out as a normal summer night. My friend Alex and I had driven out about 20 minutes from town to a field on the edge of a state park. The sky had been clear all day, and we were hoping for a good night of stargazing. Just blankets, a couple of beers, and the usual constellation spotting. The field was wide and flat, bordered by low pines and scrub, with a little creek running along the far edge. There weren't any streetlights, no houses nearby, just open sky and the soft hum of cicadas. We set up near the center of the field, spread out our blankets, and leaned back. I had my little binoculars, and Alex was fiddling with a telescope he'd borrowed from a friend. The air was warm but humid, the kind of night where you can almost see the heat hanging over the grass. I remember the smell of dry dirt mixed with the faint pine scent. A few minutes in, I noticed something strange. The usual background noise, the crickets, the frogs near the creek, the distant owls, started to drop off. At first, I thought I just hadn't noticed a pause, but then I realized Alex had gone quiet too. I asked him if he'd heard it, and he just stared at me. The insects, the small animals, even the distant rustle of trees, it all stopped at once. Complete silence, like someone had muted the world. I felt my pulse quicken a little. We sat there for maybe 30 seconds, listening, trying to convince ourselves it was some weird local phenomenon, maybe a gust of wind or the way sound carries across the field. But the silence didn't break. Then I saw it. A soft bluish light moved across the sky, low at first, just above the tree line. It wasn't bright like a plane or a star, more like the glow from a distant neon sign, diffused and steady. The path it took was deliberate, slow, like it had a plan, a rhythm. I tried pointing it out to Alex, but even as I did, it felt like our voices couldn't quite form. I cleared my throat, whispered his name, and he just nodded, staring as intently as I was. The light didn't make a sound. No humming, no static, nothing to suggest an engine or machinery. It moved smoothly, almost unnaturally, across the sky, pausing for a second over the creek before continuing. I remember the water caught a little reflection, a faint glow on the surface, and I felt a sudden drop in temperature along my arms. It wasn't cold in the way weather can be cold. It was more like a subtle, creeping chill that made your skin prickle. I reached for my phone, thinking I could take a picture, but the screen seemed duller than usual. The glow didn't look like it would photograph well anyway. Too soft, too diffuse. I just watched as it moved slowly, deliberately, then rose slightly higher, arcing toward the horizon before it vanished entirely. No acceleration, no flashing, just gone. The sky was empty again. Stars scattered normally, no trails, no streaks, nothing. For a few minutes after, the night remained quiet. The crickets and frogs didn't return right away, and even the breeze felt subdued. I kept scanning the field and tree line, expecting to see it reappear or some other sign, but nothing came. Eventually, the natural sounds of the field trickled back. A frog croaked, a distant cricket chirped, and the world started sounding normal again. But there was this lingering feeling that something had passed through, leaving the night temporarily unmade. We stayed for another hour, talking quietly, trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a drone? A weather balloon? A distant spotlight catching low clouds? None of it fit. The light's path, the sudden silence, the subtle cold, they didn't match anything man-made or natural I'd experienced before. Alex kept checking his telescope, scanning the tree line and sky, but after a few minutes he shrugged and said, "I don't know what that was." I agreed. On the drive back, the roads were empty, the car stereo quiet because neither of us felt like talking much. We drove through the usual stretches of forested highway under the same stars, and for a while I kept glancing toward the horizon, half expecting that bluish glow to appear again. It never did. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the absence of sound, imagining the way the light had moved, the unnatural calm that had swept over the field. I went back to the spot the next morning in daylight, hoping to make sense of it, but it was just a normal field again. The creek babbled as usual, the grass swayed in the wind, and the tree line looked like nothing had ever passed through. No traces, no signs. I've gone back a few times since, once with Alex, other times alone, and nothing remotely like it happened again. The field is just a field, the sky is just a sky, and the nights are filled with the usual sounds of wildlife. But sometimes when the wind dies down and the cicadas stop for a moment, I can almost feel the memory of that silence. And I remember the way that light moved so deliberately, like it was aware we were watching, like it was testing the night itself. I still don't know what it was. I don't know if anyone else could have seen it, or if it was something ordinary I can't explain. All I know is that for those few minutes, the world acted differently, and something moved across the sky that wasn't meant to be there. Or maybe it was meant to be there, just not for us. And thinking about it now, I can feel that pause in the night, the sudden emptiness, and the slow, deliberate glow that left the field forever changed. even after everything returned to normal. I'd been hiking the northern stretch of Cedar Ridge all afternoon, trying to make it to the overlook before sunset. The forest there is thick, pines and maples so close together that sunlight barely touches the forest floor even in the middle of the day. I was alone, just me, my backpack, and a trail I've walked half a dozen times. The weather had been mild, warm enough that my hoodie felt unnecessary, but there was that early autumn chill creeping into the air. I remember it most vividly right around 6 o'clock. I'd stopped on a small clearing to drink water and catch my breath. The sun was dipping lower behind the ridge, casting long shadows between the trees. That's when I noticed something odd. The birds completely stopped. 1 second, there was the usual chorus, sparrows, robins, even the occasional woodpecker hammering somewhere out of sight. Then silence. The wind stopped too. I could hear my own breathing, the rustle of my backpack straps, the faint creak of branches. Everything else just paused. I shook my head, thinking maybe I was imagining it. I'm used to these woods, and sudden silence isn't unheard of, but this felt different. Heavy, almost deliberate. That's when I saw the light. It was round, small, maybe the size of a softball, hovering about 10 feet above the ground, suspended perfectly between two tall pines. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the forest like a flashlight, just a dim, pale glow that shifted slightly like a bubble reflecting some invisible source of light. I froze. My first instinct was to reach for my phone to take a picture, but when I pulled it out, the screen looked like static. Nothing would focus. I don't know how long I stood there, but I remember thinking 10 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe longer. The light didn't move, didn't flicker, didn't change. It was just there, suspended in the fading light. Every time I tried to look away or blink, it seemed to shift slightly, like it was aware I was watching. My watch was strapped to my wrist, a simple digital one, nothing fancy. When I checked it after I finally moved again, it had jumped ahead nearly 15 minutes. I hadn't stopped, hadn't even bent over. My steps and pace were consistent. That threw me off more than the light itself. I've never experienced anything like it. I took a cautious step forward, then stopped. I wanted to see if the light would react, and it didn't. No movement at all. The air felt thick, almost like the forest itself had tensed. My gut told me to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted. I tried calling out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded hollow, like it bounced around the trees but didn't reach anything. The light stayed the same. Eventually, the shadows deepened and the dim glow began to fade. Not like it blinked out, but slowly, as if someone had turned a dimmer switch. 10 seconds passed, maybe 20, and then it was gone. The forest sighed with a gentle breeze, birds began to chirp, and the wind picked up again. Time felt like it realigned, and I noticed the sun was lower than I thought, the sky a faint wash of orange and purple. I kept hiking toward the overlook, but the forest didn't feel normal. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me tense. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the light to reappear. It never did. I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the watch didn't lie. I can't explain the 15-minute jump. At the overlook, I sat on the wooden bench, looking down at the valley. The fading light made the river glint, and for a moment, the world felt normal again. I pulled out my phone to try recording, but it showed the same static from before. Even after leaving the forest, the camera app wouldn't function properly for nearly an hour. On the drive home, the woods on either side of the road looked ordinary, the way they always do at dusk. But I noticed myself glancing at the rearview mirror too often, half expecting to see a faint glow drifting through the trees. The roads were quiet, my radio barely audible over the tires on asphalt. Every time I thought back to that light, my stomach tightened. Not with fear exactly, but with that strange mix of awe and unease that something completely outside normal perception had been there. When I got home, I checked my watch again. The time matched what I expected, minus the 15-minute jump. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling of that pause in the forest lingered. I went through my gear, making sure I hadn't dropped anything, leaving behind a trail marker or a camera that could explain the light. Nothing. I've returned to Cedar Ridge since then, multiple times, and I can't tell if it's reassurance or stubbornness. Sometimes I take the same trail, trying to see if it happens again. But the forest is normal. The birds chirp, the wind blows. No lights, no pauses, no lost time. Yet every now and then, when I'm hiking alone near those tall pines, I feel the weight of that silence press down, and my steps slow instinctively, waiting for something that might never come back. Even writing this, I struggle to put it into words. I've told a few friends, but they either laugh or say I let my imagination run wild. I know what I saw, or at least what I experienced. The light, the pause, the jump in time, it was real to me. But I also know it doesn't make sense, and maybe that's the point. Some things are just outside the normal flow of things, and all you can do is keep moving, hoping the world aligns again after it passes. I don't hike alone in that section of Cedar Ridge after sunset anymore. Even in daylight, I find myself keeping my pace, glancing at those two tall pines. Sometimes when the sun filters through the branches just right, I swear I can see a faint shimmer between them, just a hint, and my stomach tightens like that night. I keep walking though, because the forest is real, the trail is real, and the glow never lingers. Never like that. I was driving back from visiting my sister in a neighboring town, taking the long way through a few small towns to avoid the highway. It was around 11:30 p.m. and the roads were mostly empty. I remember the air being sticky for late summer, the kind of night where even the headlights seemed to stick to the asphalt. I had the radio on low, nothing too loud, just some old folk station playing quietly in the background. Main Street and Harper's Crossing always felt like it had been stuck in the 1970s. Low brick buildings, a few shuttered stores, and a water tower that dominated the skyline. I rolled slowly past, thinking about stopping for coffee at the 24-hour diner, but it was just too late. That's when the street lamps started acting weird. At first, it was subtle. One of the lamps flickered like a bulb about to go out. Then the next one did the same, and the one after that, moving down the street in perfect sequence. But instead of the usual staggered timing of dying bulbs, all of them blinked together, and then all went dark for a moment, like someone had hit a switch. My stomach flipped. I slowed the car, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I was the only one on the street, and the air felt heavier suddenly, thicker somehow. That moment of darkness lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough to make the night feel wrong. When the lights came back, it was simultaneous and steady, like nothing had happened. I was about to shrug it off when I noticed the glow above the water tower. It was pale, almost a sickly white, hovering maybe 30 feet above the metal structure. My first thought was a drone, but it didn't move in any way I could identify. It rotated slowly clockwise like it had an internal axis, but there was no sound, not a hum, not a whir, nothing. I even rolled my window down, thinking the wind might be carrying some faint mechanical noise. But the night stayed silent. I tried to focus on it through my windshield. The street lamps illuminated the lower part of the town, but the glow of that object seemed to absorb light, not reflect it. It was subtle, almost easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. I instinctively grabbed my phone, intending to take a picture, but the screen didn't want to cooperate. The camera app opened slowly, and when I tried to frame it, the object seemed to shift slightly, just enough that the shot looked like a blur. I felt a creeping unease, the kind that makes you notice every shadow around you. The usual night sounds, crickets, distant barking, a car engine far off, had gone quiet again. Even the hum of my truck seemed too loud compared to the unnatural stillness of everything else. I watched the object for maybe 2 minutes. It rotated slowly, the pale light pulsing just slightly as if breathing. I was almost certain it was watching me back. I know that sounds ridiculous, but the way it seemed to respond whenever I moved my head made me freeze. I didn't dare reach for the radio to break the silence. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second it hovered there above the water tower. The next, the night sky above Main Street looked normal, like I'd imagined the glow in my peripheral vision. The street lamps flickered again, this time once, twice, then steady, like they'd never gone dark before. I blinked, checked the water tower, the surrounding buildings, even the sky above the nearby trees. Nothing. I sat in my truck for a while, trying to convince myself I was imagining it, maybe a trick of the streetlights reflecting off a low cloud or some weird electrical interference. But the sensation, the unnatural pause in the night, the way every living thing seemed to hold its breath, I couldn't shake. I started driving again, slowly, glancing back over my shoulder at the water tower, half expecting the light to reappear. It didn't. The road stretched out empty ahead, the radio playing normally now, and the normal summer night sounds returned gradually. A distant dog barking, crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in a slight breeze. It was like the town had exhaled after holding its breath, settling back into normalcy. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't stop replaying those moments. Every time I passed a street lamp, I found myself watching it, waiting for it to flicker, waiting for that pale light to reappear. Nothing did. When I got home, I tried telling my sister about it over the phone, but she just laughed and said I was tired. I wasn't tired, not in a sleepy sense, more alert than usual, heart still thumping from that heavy silence in Harper's Crossing. Even now, thinking back, I can picture it, the way the object rotated, the faint pulsing, the pause in the natural rhythm of the night. I've driven through Harper's Crossing plenty of times since then, at night and during the day. The street lamps behave normally, the water tower just towers over the small town, the same as always. But sometimes when I'm alone in the truck late at night, I swear I can feel that pause in the air, like a moment that exists slightly out of sync with the rest of the world, and I glance at the water tower, half expecting that pale light to reappear. It never does, and yet the memory of it lingers. I don't know what I saw. It wasn't a plane, a satellite, a drone. None of the usual suspects fit. It was there and then it wasn't. And the town went back to normal as if the weirdness had never happened. But for me, that night changed the rhythm of quiet Main Street, if only in memory. I had set out that evening, thinking it would be like any other late summer fishing trip. The river I usually go to is quiet, tucked away in a corner of the forest about a 30-minute drive from town. It's the kind of place where the road turns to gravel and you start hoping your phone has any signal at all. That night, the sky was a burnt orange fading into gray, the sort of half-light that sticks to the trees and water. The air was warmer than usual for early September, humid, with that subtle hint of wood smoke from someone's cabin upstream. I parked on the old dirt turnout, grabbed my rod, and started walking down the bank. The water ran clear and cold, but that evening it already felt a little heavier, almost viscous. I thought it was just me imagining things. The ducks and geese were still out there, scattered across the river, making their usual gentle noises. Nothing out of the ordinary. I set up my line and cast, letting the bobber float down into the current. A few minutes passed and everything was quiet except for the river's gentle rush. Then abruptly, the birds went crazy. Every single duck and goose in sight launched straight into the air, wings flapping frantically, squawking like something had startled them. It was unnatural, not startled by a predator, not a typical flock panic, but coordinated, almost purposeful. They didn't scatter in random directions either. They rose straight up, circling above me for a moment before slowing and forming a tight pattern overhead. I froze. My stomach dropped. Something about the timing of it all felt deliberate. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought it might be a reflection of the sunset on the water, something bending in the heat haze, but the light didn't shimmer. It hovered, a solid pale glow, disc-shaped, low over the river. It didn't move. No engines, no rotors, no sound. The water lapped quietly against the shore, birds circling silently around it. I couldn't take my eyes off it. I fumbled with my phone to try and get a picture, but as I held it up, the object blurred slightly, almost like it didn't want to be captured. The ducks and geese paused mid-circuit, hovering as if suspended. The temperature around the water seemed to drop rapidly, even though the air just moments ago had been sticky and warm. My jacket wasn't thick, but I could feel goosebumps forming on my arms, and the riverbank under my feet felt slick and cold. I tried calling out to my friend Mark, who sometimes comes fishing with me, just in case I'd lost it or hallucinated the whole thing. Nothing came through. Not even my own voice sounded right, muffled, like the air itself was thicker. I looked back toward the road just to make sure I wasn't imagining the isolation. But the gravel turnout was empty. No cars, no people. Just forest pressing in on both sides. I blinked, and for a moment the shape seemed to shift, not in position, but in brightness and texture. The pale disk looked almost liquid, like the surface of the river had somehow risen and hovered. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, it shot upward at an impossible speed, vanishing into the clouds before I could even track it fully. The birds scattered again, shrieking, and the air warmed back to normal almost instantly. The river itself, though, stayed icy under my feet, more than it should have for the season. I spent the next hour along the riverbank trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of experimental drone, some light-reflecting weather phenomenon, or just a trick of my own tired mind. But nothing made sense. Drones don't make entire flocks of birds respond in synchronized panic, and no cloud reflection could hover low and disappear with that kind of precision. The water temperature, the silence, the feeling of being watched, it didn't line up with anything natural. Eventually, I packed up, still keeping my eyes peeled over the treetops, and walked back to the truck. I didn't speed off. I wanted to see if anything would reappear. Nothing did. The forest was quiet, the road empty, and the river just a river. Even the birds, scattered across the sky as they returned to the trees, seemed normal again, as if they'd never been disturbed. I drove home in near silence. Every shadow on the road made me glance over. Every reflection on the water at roadside ditches made my stomach tighten. I tried calling Mark again, just to get some reassurance that my voice came through. He picked up eventually, and I told him I'd be home late. He joked about me getting eaten by a bear, and I laughed, but the laugh felt hollow. That night, I kept looking out my window at the sky, half expecting that pale disk to return. Nothing did. The next day, I went back to the river, same spot, morning mist and all, but it was just the usual birds, just the water, just the forest. The trail leading to the river looked exactly like it always had. I've gone back a few times since, always in daylight, always with friends, and never once saw anything like it. The birds never reacted in that way again. The river felt normal, and the air had its usual warmth. But I can't shake the memory. The disk hovering low over the water, the sudden cold, the silence around it, and how the world seemed to pause for those few minutes. I don't know what it was. I don't know if anyone else could have seen it. All I know is that something moved through the river that evening that shouldn't have been possible, that made the natural world respond in a way I've never seen before. And even weeks later, thinking about it, I can feel that cold on my feet, the birds circling silently, and the way the light vanished into the clouds, leaving me alone with nothing but questions. I got to the cabin just before sunset. It's one of those older lakeside spots, tucked into a clearing up past the main road in northern Minnesota. I go there to get away from everything. The phone, work, people. I like the quiet, the way the lake swallows sound, how the trees lean over the water. This trip was supposed to be a solo weekend, no internet, no interruptions. I set up the fire pit and unpacked my gear, hiking boots and a small backpack with some food and a few trail markers I use for my evening walks along the shoreline. By the time I was settled, the sky was that deep blue that only happens in early October, the kind that almost makes it feel like you're underwater. The lake was glassy, the kind of calm that makes you expect a sudden ripple to be something alive moving under the surface. That first night, I went for a short walk with my flashlight, just following the markers I'd placed along the path. The air was cold, almost sharp, and every sound, the snap of a branch, a bird settling for the night, felt louder than it should. That's when I noticed something odd. Across the lake, just skimming the surface, a faint green glow pulsed. It wasn't bright, just enough to stand out against the black water. My first thought was a boat, or maybe someone's lantern, but there were no cabins on that side, no docks, nothing. I aimed my flashlight toward it, trying to catch whatever it was. The moment the beam touched the water, the glow vanished. It didn't move away. It didn't fade naturally. It just disappeared, leaving a few ripples that seemed to linger longer than normal before settling. I blinked, shook my head, and checked the water. Nothing. Just the black reflection of the sky, the occasional flicker of moonlight. I went back to the cabin, trying to tell myself it was my eyes adjusting or phosphorescence from some natural phenomenon. I poured a cup of coffee and sat by the fire, but my mind kept returning to that glow. Even inside, the air felt different, heavier somehow, like the lake itself was holding its breath. I tried not to dwell on it, but every time I glanced out the window toward that part of the lake, I felt like I was waiting for something to reappear. The next morning, I decided to do a proper hike along my usual trail. I followed the markers I'd set the night before, but soon realized something was off. One by one, they weren't where I remembered putting them. Some were missing entirely, and the ones that remained were slightly askew, like someone had moved them. I thought maybe I'd misremembered, but I swear I had been methodical placing them, and I always double check. As I walked, I noticed the forest felt quieter than usual. No wind rustling through the pines, no distant bird calls. Even the lake, when I looked back at it, seemed unnaturally still, like a sheet of dark glass. Then I caught a glimpse of a flicker of green near the tree line, just past where I'd expect it from the lake. My heart picked up, but when I looked closer, nothing was there. Just shadows stretching across the path. I kept hiking, trying to focus on the trail, but my compass started acting up. The needle wavered, spinning slightly before settling in odd directions. I stopped and held it flat in my palm, watching the needle twist back and forth. I've used that compass for years. I know it's reliable. It wasn't broken. Something was interfering with it. I could feel that. By the time I made it back to the cabin, I was tense, but I told myself it was just nerves, maybe the isolation messing with my mind. I packed up some of the markers and checked the shoreline again. The water was still, but I could swear there was a faint shimmer beneath the surface, a green pulse that seemed to move in time with my own heartbeat. I pointed my flashlight, and as before, it vanished instantly, leaving only the water and those lingering ripples. That evening, I tried to record the lake with my phone, thinking maybe I could capture something, but nothing showed up on the screen, just the dark water and the stars reflecting faintly. Even reviewing the footage later, there was no hint of movement, no glow, nothing. It was like whatever I had seen only existed in the moment. I stayed the night inside, lights on, fire crackling, staring out at the lake. The silence was complete, too complete, and the occasional snapping of branches outside felt amplified. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the glow, but I knew better. Something had been there, just beyond perception, and it had noticed me noticing it. The next morning, I packed up, taking down what was left of my trail markers. I left the cabin and walked the path once more, half expecting the green shimmer to rise from the lake or reappear in the woods, but the forest was empty. Quiet, normal, in a way that made the previous night feel distant, unreal. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of those ripples, the way the glow had vanished the instant I shone the light. Driving back down the winding forest roads, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the lake one last time. The water looked like any other lake under a morning sky. No shimmer, no green pulse, just reflections of trees and early clouds. I told myself I'd just been tired, stressed, maybe letting the isolation play tricks on my eyes. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen. I don't know what it was, or why it disappeared when I looked directly at it. Even now, weeks later, I think about it. Sometimes in my backyard, when the air is still and the stars are bright, I get the same feeling, that weight of attention, that quiet hum of something unseen. And I can't help but wonder if those trail markers were moved by the same presence, if the lake, the forest, and that glow were all part of something watching, just out of reach. I haven't gone back yet, but I know I will. Not to find answers, there may be none, but because whatever was there, I know it wasn't just a trick of the night. It left marks both on the trail and in my memory, and I have a feeling it's waiting patient beneath the water beyond the trees, somewhere just out of sight. I was walking my dog Tucker around 8 that evening. The sky was overcast, a thick gray blanket that made everything look muted, and there was that damp smell in the air you get right before rain. I didn't usually take him out this late, but I'd gotten stuck at work and figured a quick lap around the neighborhood wouldn't hurt. Tucker seemed restless, pulling on the leash like he knew something was off. We just passed the cul-de-sac near the Johnsons' house when I noticed it. Their porch light flickered once, then twice, and then went dark. I shrugged at first, assuming it was a bulb about to burn out, but then I realized the neighboring lights, my own front porch, the Harrisons, even the street lamp across the road, were all doing the same thing. On, off, like a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tucker froze beside me, ears up, staring toward the treetops at the end of the street. I followed his gaze and saw something that made me pause. Above the tallest oaks, a silver shape hung in the sky, moving slowly, almost lazily, against the wind. I couldn't make out a form, nothing like a plane, no wings, no tail, but the surface caught what little light there was and shimmered faintly. It wasn't bright, not like a spotlight or streetlight, just a reflective, metallic gleam that moved with a smoothness that felt unnatural. I stopped walking, clutching Tucker's leash tighter, and squinted. The object drifted slowly across the treetops, keeping a steady altitude, moving in a way that didn't match any aircraft I'd ever seen. There was no sound, not even a faint hum or the whistle of wind, just that steady, glinting motion. The blinking of the lights continued below, all synchronized perfectly. On, off, in unison. I looked down the street and saw a pattern forming. It wasn't random, it was like the lights were reacting to something, maybe even to the shape above the trees. My heart started racing, and I realized Tucker had gone completely still, muscles tense, growling low in his throat. I pulled out my phone, hoping to record something, anything. The screen lit up, but as soon as I pointed it toward the object, the silver shape vanished. Just like that, gone. I blinked, waited a beat, and scanned the treetops again. The clouds were uniform gray, nothing breaking the horizon, and yet the shape had been there a second ago. Below, the lights blinked once more, then everything went back to normal. The porch lights stayed on, the street lamps steadied, and the usual hum of the neighborhood returned, the distant sound of a car, a dog barking somewhere down the block. I looked at Tucker. He was panting softly now, but his ears were still up, alert, like he knew something had shifted, even if I couldn't see it. I kept walking, trying to process what I'd just seen. Maybe it had been a reflection, some odd alignment of lights with the clouds. But everything else, the perfect synchronization of the outdoor lights, the movement of that silver shape, the way it vanished, didn't fit any normal explanation. I reached my house, locking the door behind me, and sat on the porch for a while. Tucker lay at my feet, occasionally glancing at the tree line. I thought about calling a neighbor, like asking if they'd seen the lights or the object. I didn't. I was too aware of how strange it all sounded, how easily someone could dismiss it as imagination or a trick of the eye. I went inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been observing us from above, testing boundaries, or simply existing in a way I wasn't meant to understand. I checked the backyard through the sliding glass door. Nothing. The trees swayed normally in the breeze, the clouds hung heavy and gray, and the neighborhood looked entirely ordinary. I stayed up late that night, checking the skies through my bedroom window, but the sky remained empty. No silver shape returned, no synchronized lights flickered, just the usual quiet hum of a suburban night. I tried to rationalize it, satellites, weather balloons, reflections from some distant lights, but the coordinated blinking of every outdoor light didn't fit any of that. Over the next few days, I asked around. Nobody mentioned seeing anything unusual. My neighbors hadn't noticed the lights, and the Johnsons swore their porch light had been fine. I checked online to see if there were any reports of strange aerial activity, anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. The night was just empty, normal, mundane. I still take Tucker out around that time, mostly because he's used to the routine. But I pay attention now, always scanning the treetops, the edges of the clouds. I look for that faint glint, that strange metallic shimmer, though I know it probably won't be there. I keep the porch lights on longer too, though part of me wonders if the blinking had been a response, some signal I don't understand. I don't know what it was. I don't even know if it was intelligent, or if it was just some anomaly of light and metal in the sky. All I know is that for those few minutes, the ordinary suburban world went silent, in a way that felt deliberate, watched like the rules of the neighborhood, and maybe the world had shifted just slightly. Even now, months later, I catch myself glancing at the clouds during evening walks, half expecting that same silver shimmer to drift above the treetops. Tucker, as always, notices it too, ears pricked, nose twitching, even though there's nothing to see. and for a moment the world feels just a little less ordinary than I thought. I was up early around 5:30 a.m. trying to get a run in before the sun fully hit the mountains. It was that thick autumn fog that rolls down the valleys and sticks to the trails. You know, the kind where the trees look like blurry silhouettes and the ground seems softer underfoot. I like running alone in the mornings. Just me, my rhythm, and the trail. That day, though, something felt off almost immediately. About a mile in, I started hearing it. The dogs. Not just the usual occasional bark, but all of them at once, from the neighborhood down the slope. A deep, continuous barking that cut through the fog. At first I thought maybe a coyote or a bear had gotten near the houses, but the sound was different. Sharp, synchronized, almost frantic. Hundreds of yards apart, all barking together. It stopped me cold in my tracks. I stood there listening, heart picking up, the fog curling around me like it was alive. Then I saw it. Not at first, not clearly. A small white orb floated through the fog a little way ahead on the trail, just above the ground. It moved slowly, almost gliding, and for a second I thought it was a reflection of my headlamp off moisture or maybe a stray light from someone's porch. But as I focused, it held its shape, steady, like it was aware I was looking. The dog's barking quieted immediately when the orb paused. Just silence. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The trail felt colder, though the air temperature hadn't changed. I fumbled for my phone to try and get a photo, but the signal was gone. 0 bars. Not unusual up in the mountains sometimes, but this was right where I usually have reception. I stared at the orb and then it moved again, drifting toward a ridge above the trail. I thought about calling someone, but every instinct told me to stay quiet and still. My chest tightened. The fog thickened around the ridge, and then it was gone. Just gone. 1 second it was hovering there, the next nothing. The silence was uncanny. Even the air seemed still. No wind, no rustle, nothing. I started jogging again, slower this time, listening. The dogs had stopped barking entirely. I could hear my own footsteps, but nothing else. Not a bird, not a squirrel, not the wind through the pines. I kept moving for a few minutes, checking behind me, checking the ridge, but the fog didn't change. Nothing reappeared. My phone still had no signal. I tried calling my partner, but nothing connected. Eventually, after maybe 20 minutes, it came back. I was too shaken to even check messages. The rest of the run was uneventful. I went slower, stayed on the main trail, and tried to rationalize what I'd seen. A trick of the light, a reflection, maybe a distant lantern that moved strangely through the fog. But the way it paused, the way the dogs reacted, and that silence afterward, I can't explain that. When I got home, I checked the neighborhood. The houses were normal, dogs were back to barking at normal morning sounds, nothing seemed disturbed. I asked a neighbor later if their dogs had been up that morning. They said yes, they went crazy for a little while, then quieted, but no one could explain why. Another neighbor tried calling in from the road to see if anyone had a light out, some kind of early morning work, but no one had been outside. I went back up the trail the next day, the fog lighter, and nothing happened. No orb, no dogs barking, no strange stillness. Everything was normal, almost unnaturally so. The trail markers I usually pass were untouched, the trees just trees, the valley just a valley. I ran the same stretch again the following week, morning fog, early hours, and nothing. I keep thinking about it though. The orb, the synchronized barking, the complete silence that followed. How something that small could command that kind of reaction in animals is beyond me. And the signal disappearing like that, it wasn't long, but enough to make it feel like I'd stepped into a pocket where the usual rules didn't apply. I've gone back to jogging the trail, but I try to avoid that section at first light now. Even without fog, even when the sun is up, I feel like something might be watching. I keep checking over my shoulder, keep my phone ready, but it's been weeks and nothing has returned. I don't know if it's gone for good or if it's just waiting for the right conditions. Sometimes, when the morning is quiet and there's a low mist over the valley, I swear I can feel the same presence, the same stillness pressing down, the way it did that morning. I haven't told many people because I don't have an explanation and I don't want to sound crazy. But every time I lace up my shoes and head up the trail, I think about that orb hovering through the fog, and how the dogs knew to stop barking the instant it paused. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it's something natural or something else entirely. All I know is that the fog was thick, the air was still, and for a few minutes the world felt like it had shifted just a little. Something else was there, just out of reach, and it noticed me. And that, more than anything, is what I remember. I was sitting cross-legged on the dirt next to our little campfire, the flames low and sputtering when Maggie nudged me. "Did the lantern just flicker?" she asked, her voice barely above the whisper of the wind sweeping through the canyon walls. I glanced down at the lantern between us. It was one of those propane ones, the kind that hums a bit when it's on. The light pulsed once, then went dead, leaving us in a darkness so thick it felt like it was pressing in from every direction. I fumbled with the knob, checking the fuel, making sure I hadn't turned it off by accident. Everything seemed fine. The tank was full, the ignition clicked, but no flame, no glow, nothing. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though the air was calm, the only sound the faint scrape of sand against rock. Maggie didn't answer, just tilted her head toward the sky. I followed her gaze and froze. The stars were usually scattered all over the desert sky, sharp points of light stretching to the edges of the horizon, but something massive had moved across them. At first, I thought it might be a cloud, but it wasn't. The shape was solid, darker than the night itself, moving with a slow, deliberate glide. It passed above the canyon rim, a silhouette so enormous it seemed impossible, like the night had been cut out and shifted silently across the stars. I swallowed and tried to speak. "What the hell?" My voice sounded too loud, too fragile in the silence. Maggie just held my hand, her eyes wide, reflecting the faint glow of the dying fire. It didn't make a sound. No wind, no engine, no whistle, nothing. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it faded. The stars came back, untouched, as if the shadow had been a hole in the sky that someone closed behind them. I looked at Maggie. She shook her head. That didn't just happen," she said. "We didn't talk for a while, just sat there, listening to the quiet." I kept scanning the horizon, expecting the shadow to reappear, some colossal object drifting just out of reach. But the desert stayed empty, still, quiet except for the occasional coyote cry, far off. Eventually, I got the lantern working again. I'm not sure how, maybe a gust of wind finally hit it right, maybe it was some fluke, but light returned. It felt fragile, tiny compared to the vast dark we'd just seen. We didn't sit around long after that. We packed some of the camp, leaving the fire to die down, and crawled into the tent. The desert night pressed close, the stars bright and ordinary again, but I couldn't shake the sense of eyes, or something bigger, watching from above, just beyond the edge of perception. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I drifted, I thought I heard that faint pressure of air moving over the canyon, and I kept seeing that void glide across the stars when I closed my eyes. Maggie eventually dozed, but I stayed awake, staring at the faintly lit tent walls, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks. At some point, I must have nodded off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was nearly dawn. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dry sage, the lantern long since out again, and the desert was quiet and empty, as though nothing had moved through the night at all. We packed up and drove out of the canyon without speaking much. Maggie glanced back a few times, her hands tight on the steering wheel, and I followed her eyes, half expecting to see that shadow trailing behind us, suspended in the morning sky. But there was nothing. Just miles of empty desert stretching toward the horizon. Later, when I tried to tell people about it, about the shadow moving silently across the stars, most of them smiled politely and shook their heads. "Probably a cloud," someone suggested, "or a trick of your eyes in the dark." But I know what I saw. I know how massive it was, how utterly silent, how wrong it felt against the normal, quiet desert night. Even now, months later, the memory lingers. Sometimes I catch myself staring up at the night sky, waiting for that impossible shadow to pass again. I don't expect it to return, but there's a part of me that knows the desert isn't as empty as it seems. And the lantern, I never trusted that lantern again. Every time I see a flame flicker, I'm reminded of that night, of the vast, silent shape that moved without sound, without warning, and then vanished, leaving only the ordinary stars behind. I pulled off the county road and killed the engine because the sky was doing that slow, wrong thing where everything feels like it's holding its breath. My name's Mason, and I chase storms on the weekends for whatever money freelance clips bring in, and because I can't stand sitting on the couch while a wall cloud does something interesting an hour away. That day in late May, the air south of town was thick and hot and smelled like iron, the kind of heat that makes the whole horizon sag. I'd been tailing the cell all afternoon, passing pickup trucks and farmers who waved like we were all in on something. I parked on the side where you can see the field flatten and the corn rows shimmer. I set the dash cam on the hood and watched the base. Small odd things started first. The swallows that had been hunting the insects over the drainage ditch vanished all at once like somebody closed a curtain. The county radio on my passenger seat hissed, then gave me an odd squeal like a tape rewinding and went quiet for a beat, long enough to make me check the connection. My phone flashed no service for a second and then came back with 3 bars like nothing had happened. It's that kind of chasing. Small glitches that you try to explain with weather jargon but that still make your skin prickle. The wall clouds sagged lower. The wind had that tight metallic smell and the corn bent in waves like a sea. I put the camera on the windshield mount and ran the lens through its usual scrub, clean enough to record the look of a storm as if the angle matters later. The lip of the base rolled, and a little dust spun at ground level, and I thought, this could tighten. A farmer in an old pickup parked at the shoulder and watched with me. He tipped his cap and said nothing, which is the polite way country folks tell you to keep the back seat of fear. The funnel came down thin and quick, roping toward the soil. It wasn't dramatic the way TV makes it out to be. It was a machine of condensation, slow and patient, stretching toward the ground like taffy. The dash cam caught the motion, columns of dust punching up. Trucks on the far road dimmed their headlights and a dog stopped yapping in a yard. That silence is a real part of storms. It's an intake before the world rearranges itself. Then I saw the lights. They were inside the column, maybe halfway up, 3 of them, fixed. Not strobes, not navigation lights, not the wobble of aircraft. Just 3 steady points arranged roughly like a triangle, 1 near the bottom and 2 above. The rotation of the funnel should have torn anything to shreds. Instead, those lights leveled themselves with the pipe and didn't move. They weren't blinding, just sharp, white, like LEDs you can hold in your hand. The sight looked wrong in a precise way, like seeing a bookmark in a washing machine. I zoomed the camera and got out of the car because I wanted the angle and the sound. Sitting in the car felt like peeking through glass. The wind hit like a wall, and I felt the sting of grit in my face. I remember thinking I would get better footage if I kept my breath normal, like that would steady the hands. The dashcam's audio picked up the gusts and the farmer's radio 2 fields over calling something about cell moving quick, but it didn't pick up anything extra. No mechanical whine, no whir of rotors. Just the regular storm noise layered with this impossible calm inside the funnel. A bolt slashed from the cloud to the field to my left. It was the kind of lightning that makes your teeth feel like they want to rearrange. The 3 lights went out the instant the flash hit. No dimming, no stagger, just gone. In the camera, the frames show a white flash and then empty space where the bright points had been. The funnel kept spinning. The dust still rose. The lights had been inside it like beads on a wire and then nothing. I reflexively blinked, and my eyes felt like they'd had sand in them for a second. People call after a strike, and this time the calls came in quick. Other chasers texted short clips, exclamation marks, coordinates. Someone else had a dash cam that captured a tandem view, and the lights show on the frames there, too. Same pattern, same instant of disappearance, when the flash hits. We traded shaky footage and timestamps like kids swapping baseball cards. The dispatcher patched in with weather service numbers asking for reports of debris or damage, but the ground reports were mostly the expected. Flattened corn, a broken fence post, a leaning silo in the next township. No houses blown away, no injuries, nothing to pin the lights to. I kept watching after the flash because maybe they'd come back, maybe the strike had just shocked whatever was holding them. The funnel moved off the field and the rotation wobbled out as the gust front passed. The radio that had hissed earlier now fed me a stream of chatter, another crew calling coordinates, the county asking about power lines. My camera files had a few frames where you could see the triangle if you froze it, and then nothing. The farmer who'd been parked leaned out of his truck and swore quietly that he'd seen a weird light and that his kid had filmed it on a phone. He didn't seem afraid, just, I don't know, unsettled in the way folks get when the world does something it doesn't usually do. After the chase, I drove home slow and kept thinking about how precise the lights had been, how steady they held inside a thing designed to shred. At the house, I uploaded the raw footage and watched it on the laptop, pausing and zooming and trying to find any artifact that could explain the points. Reflection off hail, sun glancing off a metallic object, lens flare. The experts I know sent back cautious emails, glints off ice, a sensor error. One meteorologist friend called it interesting and asked if I'd send him the timestamps. He didn't laugh at the frames. He didn't have an answer either. In the morning, the field looked like any field that had seen a funnel, flattened rows and some broken posts. The farmer stood with a paper cup of coffee and said he slept in the cellar because that's what you do when the sky looks like it might rearrange. He told me his kid's video showed the lights too. There were the usual explanations offered in town, mirrors, drones, optical trickery, but none of them fit the exactness of what I'd seen. 3 points holding steady against spinning wind, and then gone the moment lightning struck. I kept the files, not as proof but as the record of an event that didn't line up with ordinary things. I kept watching the frames when I couldn't sleep, the 3 lights frozen like beads and then erased by a white flash. I don't have a tidy answer. I have a camera, a farmer's testimony, other chasers' shaky clips, and a memory that keeps replaying the same precise wrongness. 3 steady lights holding their ground inside a moving column, and the way they vanished the instant the sky slammed a bolt through them. I heard the buzzing before I saw anything. It was one of those October mornings where the fog sat low and the world felt like somebody tucked a blanket over it. I was 2 hours into the stand, up on a ridge that overlooks a pocket of creek bottom the locals call Hollow Run. Leaves were wet on my boots, breath white in my mask, and Boone, my dog, was curled at my feet like he'd already decided the hunt was optional. I'd climbed up before dawn out of habit because quiet mornings make you think clearer, and I needed the headspace. At first, I thought it was a power line humming somewhere off. You hear that sometimes with wet air, transformer noise carried weird. But the sound was low, like a bee, only it didn't have that frantic buzz. It was flat and steady, like a note held on an organ. It started faint, and then rolled through the trees, getting louder as if something was moving toward us. Boone lifted his head and his whole body tensed. He put his paws on my knee and didn't whine the way hunting dogs whine when they smell a deer. He was quiet and focused. My first strange moment was how the birds shut up. Not one by one, the whole chorus cut off flat. 1 minute, chickadees and jays were fussing in the oaks, and the next, the branches were still. The silence was thick, the kind that makes normal sounds feel bright and sharp when they start up again. I sat very still and listened to the buzzing grow. It made my teeth feel hollow. I lifted my binoculars and scanned the canopy. The fog made everything soft-edged, and I kept expecting to see a low-flying helicopter or a lantern bobbing above a tree line. There was nothing. No silhouette, no strobe light, nothing but columns of damp mist and a few stranded leaves hung like little flags. The sound kept moving in a slow, even swell. Boone's tail stopped wagging. He stared up through the branches and let out a single half bark that seemed swallowed the moment it left his throat. That second odd thing came from the compass on my watch. Cheap thing. I'd had it since college, but it had always pointed north like an honest instrument. On the ridge, it started to swing in tiny circles, not wildly, just a nervous little drift, like a dog pacing. My phone, which I keep mostly turned to airplane mode out here, showed a blank for bars when I checked it. No signal. Okay, fine. But the clock app froze for a tick and then caught up. Small glitches. I told myself to stop reading signs and random details. I've been at this long enough to know how the brain sews meaning into nothing when it wants a story. Uh, the buzzing got nearer until it felt overhead, like you could press your palm against the note and feel its shape. The fog moved differently then, parting a little in the spot above the hollow, and I saw the first light. It was pale and round, like a loose moonlet, and it was turning slowly. Not a tight spin, more like a slow sweep, the kind you'd make circling something with a flashlight to check for motion. It moved over the treetops at maybe the height of a two-story roof, never dipping, never swooping. It left no wake in the fog. It made no sound by itself. All the noise I'd heard up to that point was the low hum beneath everything. I snapped a couple of pictures on my phone because Reflex says record this, but the screens came back grainy and strange. When I tapped the playback, a single frame showed the light as a fuzzy disc, and then the file jumped 2 seconds forward like someone skipped a note. Boone pressed his muzzle into my hand and his whole body felt rigid. The light kept circling, steady as a metronome. It passed over an old sycamore where there's usually a hawk's nest, and the silhouette was gone, as if the trees were slightly hollowed out on that side. I thought about climbing down and following the creek to get a closer look, like I've done before when hunters in the valley shoot off flares or run lights. But the stand of trees down in the hollow didn't have the normal little sounds. No small mammals rustling, no frogs calling. The fog there had a weird thickness to it, like someone had added an extra layer to the air. My boots, which usually sank an inch into the duff, slid across a little on the ridge, so I felt off balance, like the ground had changed its texture. I tried talking into the radio just to break the quiet. "Ridge 3, this is Cole," I said, and the static picked up the tone oddly, like my voice had gone through a thin glass. On the radio, the district dispatcher answered an hour later. No, minutes later. But his voice came clipped and far, like every word had been filtered. He asked if I was on schedule. I said yes, and that I had a weird light. He asked if I was safe and told me he'd check the cameras by the road. I gave him coordinates, and he repeated them like a man reading from a list. His voice seemed to come through normal after that, but Boone still wouldn't stop staring up. The light made one full slow pass and then another. Each circle took maybe 10 seconds. On the third pass, it brightened a touch as if someone had nudged a dimmer. The trees cast a pale rim on the leaves where the light moved over them, and for a breath the world looked like someone had traced it with a soft pencil. Nothing else moved. Cars on the county road 3 miles away did not flash their headlights. No planes crossed the sky. The sound, if it could be called that, had layered itself into whatever the forest is normally like and made the usual noises seem uncertain. When the lights slowed and hovered above the biggest stand of pines, I felt something in my gut that wasn't fear exactly. It was more like a strong, annoying curiosity that keeps you from leaving a restaurant when the plate is almost empty. I told myself to pack up, get Boone, hike out, call it in properly. Instead, I reached out and put my glove over his head. He leaned into it a little and shivered. The light dimmed like a house turning its lamps down for the night. It didn't stay long after that. On the next orbit, the pale disk rose very slowly through the mist and then vanished like a coin slipping into a pocket. There was no upward rush in the air, no wind shift, no sound of propellers or motors starting. One moment it was there, the next nothing in that slice of the sky. The woods exhaled like it had been holding its breath. When the birds came back, they did so in small groups. A jay called from the ridge above me, tentative, then louder. A squirrel chittered and then skittered away like someone called it over and it remembered an appointment. Boone relaxed enough to wag his tail a little and poked my hand with his nose. I felt foolish and a touch foolish for the way my palms had sweated. I packed up methodically because motion helps when your head is full of unanswerable things. On the walk out, I met an old man from the far lane, Tom Avery, who hunts the lower switchbacks. He squinted at me and asked if I'd been up long. I told him about the light and the buzz. He nodded slow and said he'd felt a queer hum on his truck radio earlier, and that his dog wouldn't go near Hollow Run that morning. He didn't seem shocked, more like someone cataloging a weather oddity. We walked down together for a bit, and he told a story about a time a hunting buddy swore he'd seen a ghost deer that disappeared into the air. He laughed then, a small sound. It was the kind of normal you like to hear after something strange happens. I drove home slower than I usually do. Boots in the back, Boone asleep against the seat. The house smelled like coffee and a little like diesel from my truck. I told Sarah, my sister, over the phone because she's the kind of person who hears odd things and doesn't make them lighter. She asked practical questions. Did it make a sound? Could it have been a spotlight? Did I get coordinates? I gave her the best sense of place I could. She said maybe someone had been testing something out of town. Maybe. Maybe is what we had. That night, Boone slept at the foot of the bed and turned his head toward the window once in a while. I lay awake a while, not afraid but reluctant to mix the morning with my sleep. Whatever the light was, it left me with a small, precise memory. A pale disk turning slowly above the trees. A humming that pressed at your teeth, and the odd quiet that comes when a place decides to pause. The next time I went out, the forest seemed the same. Green, wet, full of small life. But I found myself checking the sky more often on the ridges, like you look up at thunder, even when there are only clouds. I had the night shift at the lot for 3 months before anything like that happened, which is to say I knew every dull corner of the place. My name's Ray. I sat in a little trailer with a space heater, 3 dead houseplants, and a coffee maker that was more decoration than appliance. The lot belonged to an old strip mall that never came back after the developer folded. There were a few chain link fences, a broken sign that still read, "Coming soon" in flaking letters, and a bank of CCTV monitors that let me pretend I was watching something important. On a slow night, my job was half boredom and half routine. Check the cameras every 20 minutes, sweep the lot around midnight, log anything weird in the book, call dispatch if someone was trespassing. I knew the routes of the raccoons and the places the stray cats liked to sun themselves at dawn. I knew when the bus came by on its last loop and when some kid would try to skip through the lot on his skateboard. Mostly, nothing happened. There were small, odd things that week, the kind you shrug off because the world never runs perfectly. One camera in the northwest corner had been flickering for 2 nights, a little vertical tear down the feed. Static that would stretch across the screen and then settle. The motion sensor by the back gate pinged twice in the morning with no footage. Once, the parking lot lights dimmed for a beat and then came back bright. The maintenance crew blamed the city grid and wrote it on a sticky note. My radio picked up 3 seconds of a voice I couldn't make out, like someone speaking underwater, and then went to clear static. Those were the things you logged and forgot. On Tuesday around 3 in the morning, I was scrolling through the feeds because the heater had died and the trailer was cold and my hands needed something to do. The main monitor was split into 4. On the lower right tile, the one that pointed at the central row of empty stalls, I saw movement. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a shadow, a trick of light. But the motion was steady, slow, deliberate. Something that ate 3 camera frames to move the width of a parking space. It looked like a shape more than anything. Not a person. The edges were soft, like a sheet dragged over a frame. It hovered maybe a foot off the ground and drifted across the asphalt without making the car's reflections twitch. The shadow didn't cast other shadows. It simply moved over them. The CCTV showed no soundbar, of course. No audio, but I could hear my own blood in my ears like it was trying to compete with nothing. I rewound the footage 10 seconds and played it slower. The shape kept its pace, slow enough that you could read the parking spot lines as it passed them. It didn't have a color, really, more like an absence inside the grainy night feed. The timestamp crawled along the bottom. 18. No brakes. I hit the pan tilt controls to get the other cameras looking where it was headed. No camera caught it from another angle. It simply glided off the right edge of that tile like it walked through a seam in the world. I stood up too fast and knocked my coffee cup. It rattled and then stopped. My hands went to the radio without me thinking. Dispatch. This is lot 29er. I'm advised of movement on camera 3, I said. My voice sounded small. Static filled my ear for a second, then the dispatcher answered in his sleepy, clipped tone. Copy lot 29er. Do you have visual? I told him what I saw and asked for backup. He told me he'd send a unit to circle the lot, that I should step outside and check. Standard procedure, soft and bland. I grabbed my flashlight and my badge and stepped out. The night hit like someone closing a door, colder than trailer air, cleaner. The lot smelled faintly like oil and pine sap. The lights over the row glared down, white and ordinary. I walked to the nearest camera pole and swept the beam of my flashlight across the asphalt, checking every concrete wheel stop, every empty cart corral. There was nothing. No tarp, no discarded blanket, no person crouched behind a planter. My breath worked in my chest like a small motor. My radio chattered that a cruiser was 10 minutes away, and the dispatcher asked me to watch from a safe distance. I walked along the central aisle where the shape had been. The headlight halos cut the air into bright bands. I shone the light under the cars. I felt ridiculous checking under a late-model sedan for a thing I couldn't even describe. But that's the job. Cover the bases so someone else doesn't have to. Near stall 7, I noticed a small circle in the dust on the asphalt. It was darker where it had been rubbed or compressed and had a perfect circumference, maybe the size of a hubcap. It wasn't a footprint. It didn't have a smear or shoe tread. It looked like a tidy thumbprint on a dusty table. I crouched and ran a gloved finger around the edge, but the dust clung. Nothing came away. There were no tracks leading to it, no drag marks. The shape could have been made by a can or a cover, except I couldn't find anything that fit. I checked the camera monitor again from the pole with my light. The feed showed the stall empty in the same angle, the timestamp moving on. I rewound to the second the shape passed and played it frame by frame. The scene on the monitor matched what I was looking at in real life, except for the phantom shape. On the screen, it drifted out of view. On the asphalt, all I had was that neat circle in the dust. The cruiser rolled in slow, and the officer clicked his flashlight around. He took the report, wrote something on his notepad, and asked if I had seen anyone hiding. I described the footage and the dust circle. He asked if I'd checked the fences. I said I'd walked the perimeter twice that night. He radioed the shift and left a patrol to circle the area. He didn't laugh. He didn't seem surprised beyond the level of professional curiosity. We all had a job to do and an evening to get through. I slept in the trailer a little, the heater wouldn't kick, and the thin blanket I kept on the fold-out couch did more to keep my shoulders warm than the heater ever did. My dreams were empty boxes and the sound of a projector clicking film. By dawn, I had coffee in hand and my bones in motion. The patrol gave me their file number and the sergeant's card, and then they were gone, the cruiser slipping down the access road like any other night. At 8 o'clock, the janitor, Luis, showed up to sweep the lot. He had the sort of face that does not flinch easily, 10 years on this shift and a gentle reserve that refuses drama. I told him about the shape and the circle, and he nodded slowly, squinting at the morning sun as if light might reveal what the CCTV couldn't. He walked the asphalt and picked at the circle with his broom, and then stopped and shook his head. It was washed clean by the morning dew, he said. He swept the dust away like it was a stain. We both watched the sweep and the brush kick up little puffs of dust that relieved whatever skin of oddness covered the place. The janitor's broom made the asphalt look normal again, the way a broom makes a floor seem ordinary. I took the footage to dispatch, and they archived it with a terse, unidentified object label. They said sometimes cameras caught insects close to the lens or lens flare, and sometimes pixels misbehaved. They asked if I'd check the hardware. I did. The camera was fine. Its lens had no insects, and the casing sealed tight. I went home in daylight, thinking about the clean circle that had resisted both broom and explanation, about the way the shape moved without sound and without touching. My wife, Kara, worked afternoons at the bookstore and was asleep on the couch when I walked in, a half-finished paperback on her chest. I made coffee and set the kettle to go because routine helps stitch weird nights back into ordinary lives. She asked me how the graveyard shift went, and I said, slow until early morning, and left it at that. There are things you tell and things you keep. She didn't ask the details, and I didn't press them on her. That week, people called the lot weird in little ways. Kids dared each other to set their skateboards on the cracked pavement. A night driver posted a shaky clip online of something blurry over a parking space, and the comments tried to make sense of it with jokes and explanations. The management company sent a tech out, replaced the camera, re-aimed a few lenses. They wrote maintenance in the log and closed the incident as resolved. Sometimes late at night now, when I sit in the trailer and the heater hums and everything is routine, I pull the footage back up on the monitor and watch that soft, impossible shape glide across the parking lines. I pause it where the object sits above stall 7, and I compare the paused frame to the actual asphalt outside the window. The images match, except for the thing in the frame and for the circle in the dust that the broom could entirely erase in my head. I am alive, my wife is calling me to supper, and the lot is empty more often than not. I can't say what I saw. I can only tell you that the cameras recorded it. My feet found a circle on the pavement, and the world went on like nothing odd had happened. I was driving back from the library at 2 in the morning when the light swept across the road. I hadn't planned to stay that late. Finals week makes you a bad judge of time, and I promised Mom I'd be home by midnight. The campus was empty, only a few security lights. The quad quiet, the student center dark. I took the county road out of town because it shaved 10 minutes off the drive, and because I liked the way the headlights cut through pines there. The night was cold and dry. The sky was clear, a band of stars bright over the fields. Small, weird things started before the light. First, my phone alarm, which I set for a study break, never went off even though it showed the right time. I tapped it, and it looked normal. Then the calendar app froze for a second and then came back. I blamed the laptop and my habit of letting too many apps run. Then, around the turn by the old grain elevator, the car radio fuzzed out for a beat and came back with static, like the signal had been swallowed. The digital clock on my dash blinked, midnight flicker, nothing more, but the HVAC fan kept humming like nothing happened. I watched the road and the dash because you're more alert at that hour than you think. The blacktop was slick with last week's rain residue, but there were no headlights behind me and no one coming from the other direction. The grain elevator's floodlights were off, even though they usually left one on all night. That felt stranger than it should have. A fox crossed the shoulder ahead, skinny and quick, and froze for a second at the tree line, as if it heard something I couldn't. It darted back into the brush without looking at me. I thought about calling my roommate Jared, more to hear a voice than because I wanted to tell him anything. He picked up half asleep, asked what was up, and I said nothing, because what do you tell someone? My apps are glitching, and a fox stared at a tree. He laughed and told me to drive safe. Then the light hit. It was a single, wide sweep, not a beam the way headlights are. It came from nowhere in particular and slid across the road like someone had dragged a giant flashlight from one tree to the next. It wasn't blue or orange, just a clean, thin white that flattened the world for a second. The road ahead went from black to that white and then back to black as it moved. There was no sound, a silent wash, not a whir or a chopper beat or a motor. I thought at first it was a helicopter searchlight, but the sky had no aircraft. I scanned up and out and saw only stars. My hands tightened on the wheel. The light had a quality to it that made everything seem shallow, like someone switched the world to a single layer of paint and then back again. When it passed, the grass on the shoulder looked the same, the ditch the same, but a bird that had taken off a second earlier stopped mid-flight and folded back into the hedge. Its wings were a blur of white and then gone. That shouldn't have happened. I pulled over, heart thudding. My breath fogged in a little cloud when I opened the window. The engine idled steady. I turned off the radio and waited, tense like a dog. The beam had moved on, I assumed, and if it had been a helicopter, I'd hear it. Still nothing. A car came from the opposite direction and slowed more than normal when it passed my headlights. The driver's face, at least what I could see in profile, looked blank like I felt. He didn't flash lights, didn't honk. He just eased by and kept his eyes on the road. Maybe he had seen it too. Maybe he had seen nothing at all. I watched him until the taillights were gone. I told myself to be practical. Maybe a searchlight for a barn sale. Maybe someone playing with a big LED on a pole. I switched off the engine and got out to listen, because people always go outside to listen when they want to prove something real to themselves. The air had a clean, metallic edge to it. The crickets were quiet in a way I couldn't place, and even though the rural night usually felt like it had room in it, that room felt narrow and scraped. My phone lost bars, one by one. The signal icon shrank until it showed nothing. I thumbed Jared, texted, "You awake?" and got a reply 2 minutes later. Yeah, what's wrong?" I wrote back, "Did you see lights?" He answered, "Dude, I'm on campus," and then asked if I was messing with him. I sent him a shaky video of the road where the last sweep had been. 20 seconds of empty darkness with the occasional reflection of my own dash. When his reply came, it said simply, "Weef is that?" He called, and his voice was sharper awake than before. "I'm coming," he said. I told him not to. The next sweep was different. It came from the left field, farther off, and it stayed longer, slicing the corn like a knife. It moved slowly enough that I could see the blades of corn go from shadow to silver. For a second, everything in that band seemed high definition. Then it rolled past and left the corn as dark stalks again. When the light crossed the telephone pole, all the insulators flashed bright and white and then looked exactly how they had before. Only the spider web that clung to one of them hung extra clear for a beat. It wasn't a flash, it was a precise pass. I thought of cars with good fog lights and raised my head to check the sky again. Nothing. Not a single plane. Not even a satellite. The stars didn't shift. The rest of the world kept on like someone had rehearsed being normal for years and then paused just long enough to let a stranger walk through. Jared finally pulled up behind me in his old Honda, tires crunching gravel in the way that sounds like arriving. He jumped out, hoodie up, and asked if I was okay. I waved him off. He didn't laugh when I described the sweeps. He said, "Maybe people are messing with spotlights at that new farmhouse." I said the farmhouse sits on the other side of the valley and has no lights except one porch lamp. He said to go home with him, that we could sit in his car and freak out together. I decided on that because being watched by the dark felt worse than being with someone who could keep the conversation small and human. We followed the road back toward town. I kept glancing at the fields, expecting the light to break over the ridge like a curtain reopening. It didn't. There was a sense of shape behind my ribs, a kind of pressure you get when something big shifts out of time for a minute. On our way in, a patrol car passed us, slow, lights off, but the officer didn't look up at anything. He kept his eyes on the road the way people do when they're practicing not to notice. At the diner on the edge of campus, the woman behind the counter said she'd been up all night making pies and hadn't seen anything. Some kid at the counter said his friend had posted a dash cam clip somewhere showing a white sweep across the highway, but they were all on their phones and the clips were low-res and shaky, and none of them matched the slowness I'd watched. The waitress offered us coffee without pressing. She knew finals brought people like us in at odd hours. We drank and let normal smells and steam fill the air. It was a soft anchor. I went home after that, parked in the driveway, and made sure every light in the house was on. I checked the windows and the yard, because that is what you do when you want the world to prove itself ordinary. The house hummed with the refrigerator and the clock, and Jared's snore in the other room when he came over and crashed on the couch. He slept hard. I lay awake for an hour or two, half expecting the light to sweep through my curtains, changing my furniture into a theater set. It didn't come back. The next day, I showed the shaky clip to a few people. Some said lens flare, someone else swore it was a low satellite catching city glow. Physics people on a forum argued about refraction and searchlights. I kept thinking about the way the world had looked, suddenly flattened and then resumed like nothing had happened. The beam had been clean and definite, and it had moved with a calm I couldn't match to anything I knew. I filed it away with the rest of the things that stay odd. The radio going out, the fox that stared at the tree, the grain elevator with its lights off. Weeks later, when I drove that road in the daytime, it was only a good county road with pines and the old elevator and deer that hop like small punctuation. Nights have their habits. Some reorderings pass through you like a draft through a house and leave you straightened, never knowing which way the curtain blew. I was on the porch with a cold beer when the sound started. a low, metallic rumble that didn't belong to anything I knew. It was the sort of evening that looks ordinary until you notice how quiet it is. Late June, the kind of heat that won't leave the pavement until midnight, and the sun had just folded behind the cottonwoods. I sit out there a lot, just to look at the street and the yard and let the day dissolve. My dog Otis was half asleep at my feet, one ear flicking at the occasional car. I had the game on my phone with the volume down low, and the neighbor kids were still out on their bikes, that distant squeal from a loose seat. Nothing unusual. Then the birds stopped. Not gradually, just a cutoff. 1 second a swarm of starlings were arguing in the sycamore, the next the branch was still as a statue. Otis's ear went straight up. I turned my head and the sky over the rooftops looked normal. The color between daylight and dusk, a few planes tracing slow lines. But the air changed. The sound was a single tone, deep and metallic, not a vibration so much as a pressure. It filled the space above us and sat there. My chest tightened like after heavy exercise, though I hadn't moved. I put the beer down and stood. The porch boards creaked under my weight in the way they always do. The hum didn't get louder, it just kept being there. For a second I thought it was some compressor or the county doing road work, so I called out to the street. "You hear that?" More to break the oddness than because I expected an answer. No one answered. The kids kept riding, unaware, or maybe they weren't listening. A car rolled by and the sound barely registered in its wake. My neighbor, Claire, came out from her yard with a dish towel in her hands. "You feel that?" she asked. She sounded like someone who had been convinced something was wrong and needed me to agree. "Felt like an earthquake," she said. Her voice had that small edge I now recognized, equal parts curiosity and unease. "Didn't feel a thing," I told her. I could tell by the way her eyebrows drew together that she felt something, though. A tremor, or a hum, or both. She said her pictures had rattled on the wall for a second. I checked my mantle. Every frame was straight. My lamp hadn't moved. The porch swing had not shifted. There was no evidence of any shaking. The sound changed then, a slow sweep down in pitch and back up like someone playing a giant bowed instrument way out past the trees. As it did, Otis crawled up my leg and leaned his head against my knee. That heavy dog weight that makes your joints complain but also makes you feel anchored. He wasn't barking. He didn't whine. He just watched. I tried the radio because I figure if anything in the sky is making a hum, maybe it fucks with electronics. The AM station I keep for traffic gave me nothing but static around the note. When the hum dipped, the radio popped back to life as if someone had tuned it with a finger. My phone buzzed. Claire had texted, "News alerted, tremor, tremor, did you feel quake?" And I typed back that I hadn't felt anything shake, only heard a noise. She called then, breathless with words in the way neighbors do when a thing is both small and important. "My kitchen cabinet rattled," she said. For a second, everything wobbled. I told her again my house had not moved. I couldn't explain that discrepancy. She swore the dishes had clicked. I said maybe a truck, maybe a sonic thing, anything that would make noise without leaving scars. The hum didn't stop. It sat like a hand cupping the neighborhood. It seemed to hold attention the way an unexpected silence does. You notice all the small things you hadn't before. The faucet in my yard that normally dripped had stopped. The insects went still. I could hear my own heart, which is always a humiliating honesty. I walked off the porch and toward the curb because whoever invented curiosity also invented leaving obvious safety to see what happens. The hum felt higher at the street, like the sound was layered and I was moving through parts of it. At the corner, Mr. Patel, who runs the store, had come out leaning on his cane. Felt like the ground tried to hiccup, he said. He had his phone out and was scrolling a news app. People were posting videos, blurry clips mostly, of coffee cups trembling on counters and a chandelier wavering for a second in someone's living room. None of them had the scale of a real quake, no collapsed walls, no report from the county seismograph crews. The county tweeted back saying their instruments showed no seismic event. The phrase they used was, "no measurable ground motion." That phrasing sat wrong in my stomach. No measurable ground motion doesn't mean nothing moved. It only means nothing measured it where they had tools. I kept thinking of how Claire's frames could rattle while mine were steady, how the cup in the driver's camera might have vibrated, and my porch swing hadn't. It was like two truths were happening in the same town. The hum then shifted into something almost like a chord, quiet and resonant, and everything had that sharpened smallness where you feel observed. I looked up because people always look up in those moments, and the sky above the houses was plain, nothing but the flight paths of distant jets. No lights, no drone-shaped silhouettes, just the big, indifferent dome of sky. But the air kept that changed feeling, like it had been measured and recalibrated. 10, maybe 15 minutes later, the sound eased. Not abruptly, but like someone slowly loosened a tightened string. The birds started their small arguments again, as if apologizing for their earlier absence. The kids' bikes squealed, and their voices came back to normal. A neighbor rolled a trash can, the normal domestic clatter of sundown. People drifted back inside with the solemn small jokes. Earthquake, huh? That make you feel part of an odd club. I went in too, because continuing the porch was suddenly less appealing. Inside, the TV was broadcasting the same loop, anchors repeating local calls, a reporter outside City Hall asking officials if they had anything to report. The city's emergency page said again there was no seismic signature. My phone showed a dozen texts from friends asking if I felt anything. For the first time, I replayed the scene in my head, trying to see when the hum had started, what might have come before, if I'd missed the first note. I couldn't line things up. Time felt normal when I checked clocks and phones, nothing jumped or skipped. The world had continuity, but with this thin, inexplicable overlay of sound. That night, I slept poorly. Every creak sounded like a preface. Otis tucked under the bed and twitched in his sleep. I woke once and pressed an ear to the pillow, half expecting the metallic note to be under the house. When dawn came the next day, the world smoothed back into its routines. The sycamore was full of birds again. The corner store had new fruit on display. Life kept its ordinary grammar. By the end of the week, the news ran a small item. Residents report unusual low-frequency sound, no seismic activity detected. The county experts said maybe it was a pressure wave or industrial maintenance or anomalous atmospheric propagation. You can always tell when people are buying time on an explanation. There's that soft hedge in their voices. Claire swore she felt minute aftershocks, little ticks that never happened in my house. The kids made jokes about aliens. Mr. Patel said he went to bed with the radio on to listen for it and fell asleep to talk radio like nothing had happened. I still sit on the porch some evenings. Mostly I watch a plane crawl its line and the neighborhood fall into its ordinary noises. Bikes clacking, dogs arguing over scent. Once in a while, though, I hear a faint low tone in the far distance, and my body remembers the way it felt to be cupped by sound. I check the mantel for crooked frames. I stand and look up, even though the sky is empty. I have no map for where to put that sound. No acronym or instrument that explains why some houses' plates shook and others didn't. I only have the memory of a giant, patient note that lived above us for a little while and then moved on, leaving behind a city that agreed there'd been no earthquake, and a handful of people who felt the same wrong, and nothing else to point to. I woke up to the cuckoo clock being quiet. That's the stupidest way to put it, but it was the first thing that felt wrong. I sat up, squinted at the little wooden bird jammed into its door, and the hands on the face wouldn't move. They were frozen. The minute hand pointed at the 4, the hour hand slid a hair past 3. 3:14. I rubbed my eyes and glanced around the kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave read 3:14 too. The oven display was 3:14. The old brass alarm clock by the bed was stopped at 3:14. Even the cheap phone I keep on the counter showed 3:14 a.m. exactly, like someone had pressed pause on the whole house. May sleep-talked something from the other room and rolled over. I didn't rouse her. There's a limit to how much weird you dump on someone at that hour, and I've learned to save the big talk for daylight. I put on my boots and a jacket and grabbed the flashlight by the door and left the house slow, the floorboards complaining under me like usual. The dog, Hank, lifted his head and watched me without getting up. He followed when I opened the screen and didn't bark. Outside, the air was that clear, slightly sweet cold you get in spring before the sun wakes. The yard looked ordinary. Drooped garden hoses, the mailbox leaning the wrong way from last month's wind, the path to the barn worn where I walked. I glanced up at the sky because it felt like the natural thing to do when something small has gone wrong. There was no moon, no fireworks, just low, scattered stars. But above the barn, just beyond where the roofline cut the sky, there was a pale cone. It hung there like a spotlight, but softer, like someone had put a faint white paper cone over the glow of a porch light. It didn't flicker. It didn't hum. It just sat, the way headlights sit when a car idles. For a minute, I stood on the porch and did the sensible thing. I checked all the clocks on my phone again. 3:14. I turned my watch over in my hand. One of those old field watches my father gave me. It ticked, but when I looked down, the face matched the stopped clocks. The digital readout on the truck dashboard, however, had switched to a normal time, 3:28. The truck lit up like nothing was wrong. I hated the way that made my stomach twist. Some things obeying, some things refusing. The chickens were clustered by the coop door like they were waiting for somebody to tell them it was morning. They're always loud at sunrise, but now they were almost silent. A rooster rifled his throat and stopped halfway through. The cows in the pasture over by the creek were lying down in a neat line, heads to the west like they had been told to watch. When I clicked my flashlight on and walked toward the barn, Hank padded beside me the whole way and kept his nose low. He didn't jump at the light the way he sometimes did at raccoons. He just looked at that peanut of a cone of light and kept walking. The cone didn't touch the ground. It sat maybe 10 feet above the roofline over a pile of hay bales. When I got to the lower gate, I noticed the air smelled faintly sweet. Not like smoke, but like new-cut wood mixed with something I couldn't name. The grass under my boots felt warmer than the grass a few steps away. Not hot, no singe marks, no smell of fire, but like the sun had been there a beat earlier and moved on. I went up into the loft on the ladder because I wanted a better look. The cone edged across the hay in a soft crescent, and where it touched, the hay looked a shade paler, not burned, just altered. When I reached out and touched a bale, it felt normal, dry and springy. A fly landed on my knuckle and left without buzzing. When I climbed back down the ladder, the flashlight clicked off in my hand, first time that cheap thing had ever died on me. I hit the button again, it came back. Hank gave a small woof like a laugh and nosed my calf. I checked the generator in the shed, partly out of habit, and partly because if something electrical was odd, maybe the generator would tell me. It fired up like it always did, and the gauge read steady. I stood there listening to it for a while to make sure, then shut it down because I didn't want to disturb whoever, or whatever, was hovering over the barn. I don't know why that felt decent to me, but it did. Some part of me wanted peace, like touching the generator made me feel less naked. I walked the perimeter of the pasture. The cows kept their heads turned, chewing lazily, unbothered by my presence. The pond at the far end had a perfect circle of mist over it, tiny spirals rising like the breath of something sleeping. When I tossed a pebble, the ripple ran out and came back like it always does. Nothing dramatic. No monster surfacing, nothing. Just quiet. An ordinary lake behaving ordinarily. I called Jeb over 2 fields. He's the neighbor who works nights at the feed mill, because if something weird is happening, it's better with a witness who isn't your wife. He came with a flashlight and a cigarette, hair sticking up like it had been combed with his fingers. He craned his neck once and said, "Huh, that's a proper light." He didn't say more, just stood with his hands in his pockets, looking like someone trying not to be impressed or afraid. We both knew silence. After a bit, Jeb said his radio had lost signal at 3:14 too, and his truck clock stuck. He said he drove down the lane and his headlights threw normal beams, but when he turned toward the barn, his dash flickered. We argued quietly about whether to call the state or the sheriff. We didn't call. We stood and waited until the sky started to wash toward dawn and the cone dimmed into nothing like someone had slid a sheet over it. When the cone vanished, the air felt fuller. Birds began their hesitant songs like something had given permission. Jeb lit another cigarette and took a slow drag. "Weird," he said again, like that one word could close a sentence instead of open it. Back in the house, May had finally come out and put the kettle on. She asked what took me so long, and I said, "Nothing important." That was a lie, but there wasn't any better way to say it with coffee and toast burning on the other side of the table. We ate in near silence, trading looks when the phone buzzed with the neighbor group chat. Someone had posted a picture from town of all the clocks at the courthouse frozen on 314. Someone else said their car clock had been stuck for an hour. Nobody had a story that made the whole thing sensible. The rest of the day was ordinary in the ways farms are. Fix the fence by the lane, check the drip on the new pump, haul a bale to the backfield. At dusk, we walked out to the barn again, out of habit or to prove it hadn't been imagined. The hay bales were their usual color. The air smelled like hay and diesel and rain on the horizon. The clocks in the house tick normally now. I set the cuckoo clock back when I got home, and it chattered like nothing had happened. My phone showed times and messages, and the internet running its small, indifferent world. But the spot of altered grass where the cone had touched stayed lighter for a week, like a ghost of a footprint. At night, Hank would refuse to sleep near that part of the barn and started choosing the porch instead. Sometimes when I closed my eyes, I could see the pale cone steady over the bales and feel that small warmth underfoot. I told May an evening or two later, and she said, maybe it was some kind of maintenance light. I nodded, because it was easy and quiet and maybe true, but my hands still remembered the way the flashlight stuttered when I climbed down the ladder. I don't have an answer for it. I have clocks that froze at 3:14 and a spot in the field that didn't like Hank sleeping near it. I have Jeb's shrug and the ways the cows looked at dawn. I have the way the barn roof holds the memory of light for a full week after the sky let it go. Life went on, as it always does, which is the strangest kind of proof that whatever it was, it didn't mean to take what we had. It only paused us for a while, and then, as quietly as it had arrived, it moved on. I was sitting on the porch with a cold beer and the screen door cracked open, because the evening was one of those thick, late July nights when even the cicadas sounded lazy. The sky was clear, no storms in the forecast, and the sun had just gone flat behind the trees, leaving that last wash of orange above the cornfields. I'd been half watching a baseball game on my phone, half listening to the neighborhood settle down. It was the kind of quiet that comes at the end of a workday, the good kind where you can hear your own thoughts. The first odd thing I noticed was that the birds stopped. One minute, a couple of sparrows were arguing in the maple. The next, it was as if someone had hit mute on them. That got my attention more than anything else. Birds shut up when a hawk or something dangerous is near. I looked up, expecting to see a raptor glide out of the trees, but the branches were still. No animal movement at all. My beer tasted normal. The baseball blooped on the phone. I shrugged and took another sip. Then the hum started. It was low and metallic, the kind of sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, like a refrigerator left on in the next room, but stretched out and deep. At first, I thought someone down the street had a generator running, or some of the farmers were testing equipment. I listened for a tractor or some engine noise. Nothing matched it. The hum sat in the air, steady, without pitch change, not a vibration so much as a pressure you felt in your jaw and behind your teeth. I set the beer down and stood up. The porch swing creaked when I moved. The boards under my feet were warm from the afternoon sun, but the house didn't shudder. The hum didn't get louder. It just stayed. I had the weird urge to touch something metal, my watch, the mailbox, like to check if it was transmitting through objects. My watch didn't react. The porch light buzzed its usual little buzz and stayed the same. "Marty?" I called. He's my neighbor 2 houses over and likes to be in the know. He answered from his own porch, same time-worn voice, and I asked him if he heard that low sound. He said he did and that he thought maybe it was an earthquake. "Earthquake?" I said. "You sure?" "Well, something," he said. "Felt like the house creaked a bit. Did you feel that?" I told him I hadn't felt anything shake. I'd been sitting on a sagging wooden porch for 15 years, and I can tell when a truck hits the culvert or when a thunderstorm starts. Nothing moved. The hum in the sky was doing something else entirely. Marty swore he'd felt his picture frames rattle. I said I'd check inside, but when I went through the kitchen, the frames were fine. Everything hung level. The floorboard by the sink didn't squeak in any new way. I told him it was probably a truck on the county road, and we both laughed at how quickly two grown men will try to make sense of nonsense. A minute later, the hum dipped in frequency and then rose back up. It was subtle, the way someone might shift from one low hum to a slightly higher one, like the sound had a mood. My dog Scout, who had been lying at my feet, lifted his head and looked at the sky for a long second. He shifted closer to me and put his chin on my boot the way he does when someone unfamiliar is at the gate. He wasn't barking, just alert. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the edge of my yard. The streetlights hadn't come on yet, but the last light of day made everything visible enough. Up over the rooftops to the west, there was nothing. No line of aircraft, no stars suddenly brighter. The air was clear. The hum felt like it was above us, as if a heavy machine were moving slowly somewhere out past the tree line. Across the street, Mr. Alvarez came out with his cane. He looked at me with that expression older folks get when they're trying to remember something they're not sure they remember at all. "You hear that, Tom?" he asked. He said he'd felt a brief jolt, as if the ground had tried to hiccup. But when he looked, there were no cracks, and his garden gnomes were perfectly upright. There was a kind of shared confusion in the little cluster of us that had gathered. Marty, the Alvarez boy, a woman with her child, and yet no one had anything concrete to point at. Just a sound and the feeling of being watched by it. My phone buzzed with a text from Anna. "You okay? Earthquake in town? News says tremor." The automatic alerts were running down the highway of my screen before I'd even thought to check them. I clicked on the local news site and saw the same. Reports of tremor, cause under investigation. People were posting shaky videos of still windows and cups that had vibrated in place. I scrolled through them and felt odd. The shaking in those clips was mild, pictures tilting, a plant knocking a saucer on a counter. Not dramatic, but in person I'd felt nothing like that. The hum changed then, stretching out longer, a wheel turning slowly in the belly of the sky. It behaved like a presence rather than a machine. You could almost feel it be patient, like it was taking measurements. The streetlights dimmed fractionally, like someone had adjusted a dimmer by a degree. Dogs in 3 yards down the block went silent. The crickets stopped. All the small background noises my life rested on slipped away like a record lifted off a turntable. I walked back into the house because it felt like the practical thing to do. Inside, the plates were where I had left them, the clock on the mantel ticking the same. My hands shook a little when I filled a glass with water. The hum seemed to dampen through the walls. It was less invasive indoors. I stood in the kitchen and felt as if the world had narrowed to the small square of linoleum under my feet. On TV, the newscaster read the same lines over and over. Possible seismic activity, no reports of damage, experts en route. CCTV from the town square showed nothing obvious, just people stopping and looking up. I rewound a clip and saw a person on the footage glance over, then glance up, then step away. There was a point where the camera's audio dropped into static for a second and came back. The hum had a way of messing with the way things were heard and recorded. My phone battery dinged low even though I'd been charging it. The clock on the microwave advanced as usual. Time didn't skip. There was continuity, just this thin layer of wrong across it. After maybe 10 minutes, the hum eased like someone lifting their hand. The birds resumed with an apology of song. The streetlights righted themselves. The little jar of water on the table trembled once and then stilled. People walked back onto porches, called to one another, making small jokes to regain normal cadence. The news anchors tried to make sense of the accounts, and the county posted a short statement that they had detected no seismic signature on their equipment. No earthquake recorded, the statement said, cause unknown. I went back outside. The night had cleaned itself off, like a window you had to look through twice. The sky was a deep, honest black, and a few stars were sharp. Scout shook himself, leaving a faint dust on the porch boards. Marty leaned on his railing and lit a cigarette like it was the first time he'd felt brave again. We traded the sort of thin, brittle reassurances people use when there's nothing else. "Maybe a truck," Marty said. "Maybe some testing," Mr. Alvarez suggested, though his fingers trembled on his cane. I tried to explain it to Anna over the phone later, how the sound had been in my chest more than in my ears, how the whole neighborhood felt like a held breath. She listened and said, "Maybe they'll figure it out." That's as close to an answer as I got. The next morning, the paper ran a small paragraph. Residents reported low-frequency vibration overnight, no industrial activity or seismic events identified. There were comments online. Someone said it was pipeline testing, someone else suggested a sonic boom, another insisted on government projects. None of it fit cleanly. I kept thinking about the way the hum had paused as if to let us notice it, then moved on. There was an intent to it that my brain kept trying to name and failing. I still sit on the porch most evenings. The maple's leaves have a new sheen where the sun hits them, and the cricket chorus is back to full strength. Every now and then I hear the faintest thing in the distance and my body tightens the way it did that night, listening for a repeat. Sometimes neighborhood kids will ask if they heard the earthquake too, and I tell them what I heard. A deep, metallic hum above the rooftops, a feeling that something had passed just overhead and taken the world's background noise with it for a little while. They roll their eyes and run off. I tell myself the same things: truck, transformer, natural quirk. But I keep thinking about the way the birds went quiet first, and how everyone on the street felt the same blank where normal sounds used to be. Whatever it was, it didn't announce itself clearly, and it left without leaving a mark you could point to and say, "There, that's what happened." I was on patrol in the northern section of the preserve when I found it. This was late August, early evening, still hot, but the sun was low enough that the shadows stretched across the trails. I'd driven the service truck out past one of the fire roads, then decided to hike a loop to check for campers. We'd had issues with people sneaking in for late-night parties, and I didn't want to come back the next morning to beer cans and a smoldering fire pit. The trail was quiet. Normally, even at dusk, you'd hear at least a few woodpeckers or chickadees in that part of the forest. But I remember noticing how flat it sounded, just the crunch of my boots and the buzzing of insects. About a mile in, I cut off the path because I spotted something odd through the trees. At first, I thought it was sunlight catching on a clearing. The ground looked pale, almost white in places, which was unusual considering how dense that section normally is. When I stepped into it, I realized it wasn't a clearing. It was a circle, perfectly round, maybe 20 feet across. The grass and undergrowth were gone, not trampled, not cut, but burned, or at least it looked burned. The soil itself was dark, almost like charcoal. But there hadn't been a fire in that area, and no storms with lightning had come through in weeks. I crouched down and touched the dirt. It wasn't hot, but it was brittle, flaking under my fingers. I stood back up and walked the edge, and that's when I saw it wasn't just one. There were 3 more, each about the same size, laid out in a pattern, spaced apart like points on a triangle, with one more just outside of that. Every one of them was almost exactly circular. Not jagged like a brush fire, not messy, just clean. The strangest part was the trees. Around each circle, the trunks were scorched about 6 feet up, only on the side facing inward, like something had radiated out from the center and singed them. The bark peeled away when I pressed my thumb against it. The leaves above looked untouched. I stood there longer than I meant to, just staring at the shapes. Normally, if there's fire damage, you see signs: fallen branches, blackened leaves, smoke residue. This wasn't like that. It was too neat. And the smell, there wasn't any. Burned wood always lingers, but here the air was neutral, maybe even cleaner than normal. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but when I clicked it, all I got was static. Not the usual crackle when you're out of range, just a sharp hiss. I adjusted the channel, tried again. Same thing. I stepped about 20 feet back toward the trail and tried once more, and this time it went through. I gave a quick check-in, said I was still on patrol, nothing out of the ordinary. I didn't mention the circles. I don't know why. I just didn't feel like explaining them over the radio. On the walk back to the truck, I kept hearing branches snap behind me. At first, I figured it was deer, but usually you hear them dart after the first step. This was different. It was like something pacing me, always a little behind, never close enough to see. When I stopped, it stopped. I told myself it was my imagination, pushed on faster, and didn't turn around until I was standing beside the truck. The next morning, I went back out with one of the other rangers, Carla. She's practical, doesn't spook easily. I didn't tell her exactly what we were going to see, just said I wanted a second opinion on some possible fire damage. When we got to the spot, the circles were still there, same as before. Carla crouched, poked at the soil with a stick, frowned. She kept saying, "But there hasn't been a fire." What struck me was the silence again. Not a single bird called the whole time we stood there. Normally, you can't go 5 minutes in those woods without hearing jays or crows. The air felt dead. Carla finally said, "We should mark this for inspection," and headed back. I lingered, feeling watched, though the tree line looked empty. That night, when I drove home, I noticed the usual flocks of starlings that roost near the ranger station weren't there, just an empty sky. The next few days, I checked in on the circles. The birds still avoided the area completely. Even the squirrels and chipmunks that usually dart through the undergrowth were absent. It was like the entire patch of forest had been abandoned. By the end of the week, grass had started to sprout in thin blades at the edges of the circles, but the soil at the center stayed dark. Still no smell, no tracks, nothing to explain it. I stopped going alone after the third visit. Not because of anything I saw, but because of how the place felt, like you shouldn't linger too long inside those lines, like you were being noticed. No storms had been reported, no fires, yet those circles stayed there for weeks before the ground slowly blended back into the rest of the forest. Even now, the trees around them are bare on the side that faced in. The scorch marks never faded. I was mowing the lawn that Saturday. It was early evening, late summer, still hot enough that sweat soaked through my shirt in the first 10 minutes. I remember because I almost decided to leave the yard for another day, but the grass had already gotten a little wild, and my neighbor Greg kept dropping hints about it. I figured I'd just push through, get it done before dark. The mower was loud, steady, the usual low rumble and vibration that numbs your hands after a while. I'd gotten halfway through the backyard when I noticed something. At first, I thought it was the mower itself, some kind of mechanical issue, but then I realized it was a different sound layered over it. This low, humming, steady, almost like a single musical note being held. I cut the mower engine to check it. The hum didn't stop. It wasn't the kind of sound you could point to. It didn't come from the fence line or the street or the neighbor's air conditioner. It was just there. The weirdest part was how it seemed to press down on me, like the air was vibrating. My first thought was maybe it was a plane, but the sky was completely clear, just pale blue fading toward orange near the horizon. No clouds, no contrails, nothing. I stood there a long moment, shading my eyes, waiting for something to show itself. The hum went on and on. Then it cut out, just like someone had flipped a switch. I felt stupid standing there, staring at nothing, so I yanked the mower cord again and kept going. But it didn't feel right. The whole time I pushed across the yard, I kept glancing up, scanning the sky for some explanation. At one point, I checked my watch, 6:42. The sun was still well above the trees, so I figured I had about an hour of light left. I made it maybe 3 more passes across the yard before I noticed the hum again, louder this time. I killed the mower instantly. The hum filled the space. I swear I could feel it in my chest, like standing too close to a speaker. I craned my neck back, squinting. The sky was empty, not a bird, not a cloud, just open air. And then I blinked. Or at least that's what it felt like, just one normal blink. But when I looked down at my watch again, it said 7:21. I froze. I remember staring at the numbers, convinced I'd misread them. I tapped the face of the watch, turned my wrist to the light. No, 40 minutes had gone by. 40 minutes that felt like maybe 2. The sun had dipped much lower, casting the yard in this dull orange glow. I didn't understand. I stood there in my yard, mower half pushed through a strip of tall grass, trying to piece it together. I didn't remember standing still that long. I didn't feel lightheaded or faint. There wasn't any gap in my memory. It just jumped. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the watch was wrong? I pulled my phone from my pocket. Same time, 7:21. The hum had stopped again. The silence was thick, like my ears were ringing even though there was no sound. I tried to keep working, just to force myself back into something normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I rushed through the rest of the yard, barely looking at what I was cutting, then rolled the mower into the shed and stood there, breathing hard. Inside the house, the clock on the microwave matched my watch and phone. 40 minutes, unaccounted for. Later that night, I asked Greg casually if he'd heard anything weird outside earlier. Planes, sirens, maybe a generator. He looked at me blankly and said no, he'd been grilling on the deck most of the evening. The next morning, I went out to check the yard. The mower lines were uneven, sloppy, not my usual. I could see exactly where I'd rushed through it. And in the middle of the back lawn, there was this odd patch. Not a burn mark, not flattened grass, just a circle where the blades looked slightly lighter, as if they'd been sun-bleached compared to the rest. I crouched down and ran my hand over it. The ground felt warm, even though it was still early and the rest of the yard was cool with dew. I stood up fast, wiped my palm on my shorts, and didn't touch it again. I never figured out what happened with those missing 40 minutes. The watch kept working fine afterward. The phone, too. But every time I mow now, I catch myself glancing up at the sky. I was flying a charter run out of Billings, Montana, late one evening in September. Nothing fancy, just a Beechcraft Baron, 2 passengers in the back heading to Bismarck for business the next morning. I'd done that route a dozen times. The weather wasn't great, but it wasn't terrible either. Scattered clouds at about 7,000 feet, mild crosswinds, visibility a little hazy but workable. It was the kind of night where you have to pay attention, but nothing that set off any alarms in my head. We leveled off around 9,500 feet, just above the first cloud deck, and the ride was smooth. The passengers were quiet. I remember glancing back once and seeing both of them leaning against the windows, half asleep. I settled in for what I thought would be an uneventful hop. About 40 minutes in, I noticed a light through the haze. At first, I figured it was another plane. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of regional jets crisscrossing the northern plains at night. But then another light appeared, a little lower and off to the side, and then a third one higher above. They weren't blinking like aircraft strobes. They were steady, pale white, almost bluish. What got me wasn't the fact that they were there. It was the way they locked into a perfect triangle, sharp as if someone had drawn it with a ruler. My eyes kept darting between my instruments and the windshield, trying to make sense of it. I gave it a few minutes, thinking maybe I was just catching glimpses of stars through holes in the clouds. But they didn't move the way stars should. They shifted together, holding formation, sliding in and out of the cloud edges. I finally clicked on the radio. Minneapolis Center, this is November 265 Delta Bravo. I've got traffic off my 11 o'clock, altitude unknown. Can you confirm? There was a pause, some static, then the controller came back. 265 Delta Bravo, negative contact, nothing showing near your position. I frowned, checked my transponder, checked the radar display. Clean. Nothing. But outside, those 3 lights were still there, crisp against the haze. I tried again. Center. I'm seeing 3 distinct lights forming a triangle, roughly 5 miles out, holding steady. Are you sure there's no traffic? Same answer. Nothing on radar, no transponder signals. I wanted to believe I was mistaken. Maybe it was some kind of atmospheric reflection, something bouncing off the cloud tops. But as I watched, the lights began to rotate. Not individually, the whole triangle pivoted in place, like it was on an invisible turntable. It was so precise, so smooth, that my stomach dropped. I remember glancing back at the passengers. They were still out, heads lolled, completely unaware. I thought about waking them, but something in me hesitated. I didn't want to sound insane, shouting about triangles in the clouds. I switched frequencies to Bismarck approach just to see if I'd get a different response. Same thing. They told me there was no traffic within 10 miles of me. The guy even asked if maybe I was seeing distant lightning. I knew I wasn't. Then it got weirder. The lights dimmed, one by one, until they were barely visible, like embers under ash. I exhaled, thinking it was finally over, when suddenly they reappeared twice as bright, in the exact same spots. My instruments didn't budge. No warnings, no interference, nothing. But the pit in my chest kept tightening. I tried to focus on my heading, my altitude. Flying the plane had to come first. But every 30 seconds or so, my eyes slid back to the window. The light started to drift upward into the thicker clouds above me, until all I could see was a faint glow bleeding through the vapor. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 20. My sense of time got fuzzy. At one point, I thought I saw the clouds themselves light up, like the glow was pulsing through them from the inside. There were no sharp flashes, no thunder, no sound at all. Just a silent, steady pulse, 3 points breathing together in the mist. When they finally faded for good, I kept expecting them to come back. I stayed keyed up, watching the clouds, waiting for another flicker. Nothing. The rest of the flight was silent, except for the usual radio chatter. When we landed in Bismarck, the passengers thanked me like it had been any other flight. They didn't mention seeing anything strange, and I didn't bring it up. I signed off the plane, went through the usual checks, and drove to the cheap hotel the company always stuck me in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, staring at the floor, wondering if I'd really seen what I thought I had. I filed the incident as unidentified traffic sighting, but when the report came back, there was nothing attached to it. No radar blips, no corroborating data. Just my own words. To this day, I can still picture that triangle, perfectly balanced, turning in the clouds like it didn't belong there. And I still don't know how something that clear, that solid, could show up for me and not for the instruments. I was out on the lake later than I should have been. It was mid-September, one of those nights where the air is cool but not cold yet, and the water still holds some of the day's warmth. I'd gone out alone after dinner, around 8, telling my wife I'd just drop a line for an hour or two and be back. She gave me the look she always does when I say that, because she knows me, and I promised I wouldn't stay all night. By the time I noticed how dark it had gotten, the lantern I clipped to the bow of the John boat was the only light besides the thin sliver of moon. The shoreline had disappeared into a silhouette. No cabins had their porch lights on, and the campground on the north side of the lake had shut quiet for the season. I was the only one out there. The fishing was slow. Every now and then I thought I felt a nibble, but mostly I sat listening to the small slap of water against aluminum. I remember thinking the night felt heavier than usual, like sound wasn't traveling as far. Crickets were faint, owls weren't calling. I could hear my own line tick when I twitched it. It started with ripples. At first, I thought a fish had broken the surface right behind me. The boat rocked a little, not from wind, but from the water itself shifting. I turned with the paddle and watched rings spread out, big ones, wider than anything a bass or muskie could make. I figured maybe a beaver had slapped its tail, but the circles kept coming, one after another, around the boat. It looked like something was circling me just under the surface, but no shadows passed beneath. The water stayed dark and still, except for the motion. I reeled in, not fast, just steady, and laid the rod across my lap. The ripples weren't random, they were evenly spaced, like something was pressing out from below in a slow rhythm. My boat drifted a little, and wherever I moved, the rings followed, staying centered on me. I put my hand in the water. It was calm, smooth, no current. Just as I drew my fingers back, another circle pulsed out, perfectly round, right where my hand had been. That's when I noticed the silence. Even the crickets had cut off. No bats flicking overhead, no frogs along the reeds. It was as if the whole lake had gone on pause. I told myself it was late, I was tired, maybe I just noticed normal things too closely. I even muttered out loud, "All right, enough of that," like scolding a dog. My voice sounded swallowed up. Then the light came. It wasn't like a flashlight or lantern glow. It didn't shine down from above. It flickered across the surface of the water itself, like someone had laid a pale white sheet under the top few inches. It lit up an area maybe 20 feet across, right off the bow. The beam wasn't steady. It shimmered, broke apart, and came back as if the lake was reflecting something invisible. Each time it flashed, I saw the inside of the ripples lit from underneath, bright outlines on the dark water. I grabbed the lantern and turned it toward the spot. The moment my light touched it, the pale glow vanished. The water looked like it always did, except my ripples were still spreading outward, slower now, wider. I turned the lantern off again, just to check, and after maybe 30 seconds, The glow returned, this time closer, licking the hull. The bottom of my boat lit up white for a second, and then it blinked out. That's when I pulled anchor. The oars sounded too loud as I rowed. Each stroke felt like I was disturbing something I wasn't supposed to. The lake gave back no echo, only the creak of wood against metal. Halfway to shore, the ripples started again, pacing me. They'd form, widen, fade, and then new ones would appear, always centered around the boat. I didn't see the glow again, not full on, but I caught a glimpse, just a thin band of pale light slipping across the water off my left side, like moonlight where no moon reached. It flickered once and was gone. When I got close enough to see the dock, the sounds came back. Crickets, faint at first, then normal. A bullfrog croaked by the cattails. It was like someone had unmuted the night. The ripples slowed until the water was glassy again. I tied off fast, didn't even bother unloading the gear, just carried the lantern and walked up the dirt path to the truck. Halfway there, I realized my shirt was damp, clinging like mist had soaked into it. But the air was dry. The grass wasn't wet. I don't remember any spray from the water. By the time I got home, it was nearly 2 in the morning. My wife was asleep on the couch with the TV on low. She stirred when I came in and asked if I caught anything. I told her no. The next day, I went back down to pull the rods and cooler from the boat. The aluminum along the waterline had a faint white film on it, chalky to the touch. I scrubbed at it with the hose and it smeared before finally washing away. I still fish that lake, but not at night anymore, and I haven't anchored in the middle since. I stick to the edges where I can see the shoreline lights. Every once in a while, if I'm out there at dusk, I'll watch the water close. Sometimes I think I see a circle spread out without cause. It's never big, never near me, but I pack up early anyway. I was out checking the north fence when the light hit. It wasn't a headlight or a flashlight. 1 second, the night was the usual dark. The barn a black shape, the pines a darker line. And then someone pulled a curtain of white across the field. It swept from my left to my right, quick and bright enough to make me suck air. My cigarette went dead between my fingers. My flashlight blinked and died. For a breath, I couldn't see the gravel under my boots. When my eyes cleared, the cows were all standing still, every one of them. They were near the north fence, all heads turned the same way, toward the ridge. Not chewing, not swatting flies, not shifting weight. Even the calves were statues. It was wrong, the kind of wrong that makes the back of your neck prickle. I walked out to them. Mabel, my old brown cow, stood with her mouth half open like she'd paused mid-chew. Her hide was warm, she breathed. When I put my hand on her flank, she blinked and went back to grazing, but the rest stayed like that for a long minute. I circled the group, looking for a reason, a light, a person, a glow. But there was nothing past the fence except the marsh, the pines, and a sky full of stars. I went back to the house and told myself it was a trick, headlights off the county road, or a reflection. I couldn't explain the flashlight dying or the way the light had washed out the whole world. Anna slept through it. She worked nights sometimes and her sleep was deep. I lay awake most of the night thinking about those cow heads pointing like soldiers. 2 nights later, it happened again. I was at the kitchen table doing the books. The clock read 2:14 a.m. The dogs were whining and then silent. The light came from the west this time, a broad white sweep that filled the yard and went across the pasture in 3 even strokes. The radio on the counter, old AM, mostly static, cut to dead silence when the light touched it. The dogs started to bark and then went quiet mid-bark. My flashlight went dead on the table. The little LED blinked out as if someone had taken the battery away. Outside, the cows were clustered by the fence, heads all turned north again. Their tails hung lifeless. I stood barefoot in the grass, heart hammering. There was a low sound then, a layered hum that didn't belong to anything I knew. It pressed in my chest like being underwater. The light pulsed a few times, soft like breathing. The cows didn't move. The dogs crouched and whined. I felt like the world had been put on hold. When the light slid off the ridge, they all collapsed to their knees for a second, then sprung up and rushed toward the barn like something told them to. No one was hurt. They were spooked, but fine. The neighbors, Lee and 2 others, came over in trucks. Nobody had seen anyone or anything. Phones showed normal battery levels then. Later, some told me their GPS had jumped around for a bit that night. We all talked about it for a week. Someone said they'd found a round patch of flattened grass out by County Road 7. Another said their kid's toy compass had spun funny. A vet came and checked the herd after I found a calf with some slick, wet, matted hair on its shoulder. He said it looked like sap or mud and didn't worry him. The sheriff took a report and nodded the way sheriffs do when people tell odd stories. It didn't stop with cows. Once I drove by the ditch and saw 3 deer standing rigid, necks extended, staring toward the pines. The dogs sometimes froze mid-bark and refused to move. Radios and clocks hiccuped, small things, then righted themselves. I set a cheap phone on a bale of hay one night to film. The battery was full when I started. By morning, the file was corrupted. The timestamp jumped. There was a blank 10 minutes of nothing where the image went white, and the audio was gone. When the clip resumed, the cows were standing. The file offered nothing else. People got used to it. Not used like acceptance, but used like you get used to a bad road, you work around it. We kept spare batteries in the barn and a light on the silo that stayed burning all night. Anna started leaving the bedroom window cracked because the small, steady hiss of air on the screen helped her sleep. We had to get hay in and keep the fences mended. Life pushes you back into routine. I walked the ridge once in the frost before dawn because I couldn't help myself. The grass shimmered and the sky was a dull coin color. I stood where the first sweep had come from and looked for footprints or scorch marks. There were prints, shoe prints, heading toward the marsh and then stopping at the drainage, like someone had stepped off the edge. They were boot prints, wide and straight, and ended in a tidy fan of muck. I kept that detail to myself because people like tidy answers and there was nothing tidy about the rest. Mostly there was the light and the way everything, electronics, animals, even time, seemed to hiccup. The cows would line up again at odd hours. Once, late in August, they stood facing the fence for 2 hours while dawn leaked up and a fog rose off the marsh. I sat in the truck and watched them breathe until my hands went numb. Small, strange things piled up. A set of tire tracks in the hay with no corresponding vehicle. A calf that stopped nursing for an afternoon then went back to normal. My neighbor's kid said the moon looked funny one night, like it had a smear across it. I didn't have a neat explanation for any of it. I never saw a craft or a creature. There was no tractor with a floodlight, no man with a spotlight. There was only light so bright it blotted out detail, a sound that pressed down in a way that made the dogs stop mid-bark, and animals freezing like someone had hit pause. Most mornings, everything was ordinary again. Hoof prints in mud, warm breath in the barn, radios that came back to life. One morning, months after the first sweep, I found a ring of bent cattails in the marsh. Stems broken low and splayed out in a perfect circle, maybe 8 feet across. No scorch marks, no smell. The cows wouldn't go near it. I stood at the edge and a fly landed on my wrist and left. The sky was plain. I went home and made coffee and acted like it was nothing. Sleep got harder. I found myself waking at 3 a.m. and walking the yard, looking for lights where there weren't any. When I went to check the animals, I'd stand by the fence and watch the ridge until my eyes smarted. Once, after a night where every dog on the road kept howling, I woke Anna and she came out in her slippers and just put her hand on my shoulder. She didn't ask for details. We didn't have a language for it, besides, "Did you see it?" which meant either yes or no. We started leaving the kitchen light on more often. At the feed store, a man I didn't know came up and said, half joking, half afraid, that his boy had seen the field glow over at the old Miller place, and the whole herd had faced the road like they were listening. Folks swapped small reports in a way that made them less raw. That didn't make what I saw less real. It just made it someone's story, too. I tried to be practical. I kept logs, a stupid notebook in the glove compartment, dates, times, weather, which cows looked, what died or glitched. The journal felt silly and sacred all at once. There were more blanks in it than anything. Nights where I wrote down blank and left it at that. The more I wrote, the more the pattern teased itself into a shape I couldn't quite name. People in town called it the white sweep and cracked jokes to make it smaller. Jokes are a way to keep from being the one who looks worried. We learned to check the cows more at night. I kept a light on in the barn and a rifle under the seat of the truck because it felt like an option. Now, when night comes, sometimes the light sweeps, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the cows stop and stare the way they did those first nights. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes radios hiccup and dogs go silent and a cheap phone file corrupts. I don't pretend to have an answer. I have the field, the ridge, and the way a white wash can make everything pause for a bit and then go on as if it had never been moved. I carry that image with me when I go out to fix a fence or roll a bale. It isn't a tidy story.